Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending where you are. My name is Sandro Galea, and I have the privilege of chairing the study. On behalf of the committee and on behalf of National Academies, welcome. This task is being undertaken by this committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. It includes reviewing the evidence linking social and digital media use with health outcomes in adolescents and children. The full statement of task is posted on the study website. I want to note that this is an open, on-the-record session. Interested individuals and members of the press may be attending as observers. This is not a news conference, however, and we will not be entertaining questions from the floor. Reporters who would like to talk with committee members are kindly asked to touch base with the study director, Gillian Buckley. Gillian's contact information is also posted on the study website. I would like to remind everybody that this is an information gathering session. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here today to be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions. It would be a mistake for anyone to leave here today thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including committee members, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the National Academies. In addition, committee members typically ask probing questions in these information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their personal views. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once the draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee then must respond to this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the National Academy's Report Review Committee and the National Academy of Sciences President before it is considered an official National Academies report. Finally, I will remind our speakers and guests that comments posted in the chat will be considered submissions to the committee and saved in a study file that members of the public can access. Please be mindful if you'd like to share any pre-publication study findings or other confidential comments that this is a public forum and the comments are also public. Having said all that, welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here for what promises to be an interesting session. Just by way of format, we have 3 speakers, each have an allotted time. I'll introduce each and ask them to speak. If there's still time in their allotted time, we'll take some Q&A from the panel. If not, then we will manage questions after all 3 speakers have spoken. With that said, we are delighted to start with James Williams, who is an author and technology ethicist. James, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak today and to kick things off. I'm going to try to share my presentation here. Let's see. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. Let's see. Oh, here we go.
There you go. Now see it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak with you today, and thank you all to the committee members for the time and attention you're giving to these important questions. As a father of 2 young sons myself, who, having studied some of these technology issues for several years, and now I'm kind of grappling with them, kind of in the trenches every day, so to speak. So I really appreciate the interest in doing this work and clarifying some of these issues for the public. And thank you to everyone else from the general public who's joined today and cares enough about this issue to come in and talk with us all about it. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a sound in the, maybe somebody's not muted. So I think this is a fascinating study that's kind of the set of questions that is before you all. I think, what I understand the general theme to be is kind of the broad question of how do we take this technological environment that we've inherited, and we're trying to steward as best we can, and how do we pass that on in a way that it can shape the lives of young people, as well as it possibly can, and kind of how is it shaping the lives of young people today? And so I think this is a very ambitious kind of question, and I think it's not an easy question. And sometimes it's not even, it's hard to even know how to kind of start to frame some of these issues around technology, let alone technology in children. So what I wanted to do here, thinking about like kind of the challenge of framing the question, Einstein's maxim comes to mind of, spending 59 minutes defining the question, then 1 minute solving the problem. So in this time here, what I wanted to kind of do is just kind of offer one way of carving up this problem space from my own vantage point. I'm kind of having worked in industry for several years, and then doing the research on kind of ethics and technology, and specifically around the issues of attention and persuasion. So one vantage point that's rooted in my own research that tries to just find some important connections, I think, with what my work has been and what you guys are trying to do here in this study. So periodically, I kind of have to take a step back and remember what a remarkable time it is that we live in human history. Just using some satellites orbiting the Earth and a little device in my pocket to help me get to the end of the street is something that in most eras in human history would have been consigned to the realm of myth or fancy. But now it's as common as using a toothbrush, and this is the world we live in now, and all of these technologies, whether navigational or whatever, they're kind of these extensions of ourselves, right? They're kind of prostheses for whether for the mind or for other various capacities. And in recent years, most of the kind of these most amazing transformative kind of extensions have been informational in nature, such that we call our time, the information age. Everybody's familiar with this framing. But where I wanted to start my discussion today was with the observation that was made by Herbert Simon in the 1970s, where he talks about how information abundance produces a scarcity of attention. So in a famous paper of his, he says, what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. And so I think this is one of the most kind of interesting and I think important insights in the last 50 years or so. And I think it's one that we're still really trying to internalize the implications of when it comes to our analysis of digital technologies. Because so many things we talk about, in the information age, we talk about in these informational terms. It's easy to imagine little packets of information scooting around. We can kind of, visualize it in our minds, but it's much easier than talking about attention. But if Simon's right and this inversion has happened, almost a figure ground inversion, where historically, if information was the scarce thing and we had to seek it out, but now it's the opposite, and information is overabundant, and attention, focus, giving sort of understanding, awareness to a particular thing is the scarce thing. We have to seek that out. I think that the way in which we even talk about our technologies, let alone approach them from individual or societal kind of mechanism standpoints, it stands to change, I think. And so one way of talking about what's happened, what's produced this shift, is kind of this idea that our informational tools have now become our informational environment. You used to have to go get a newspaper or even sit down at a computer to use it, or a telephone, but now it's literally instant connection with the most interesting things in the world in our pockets all day, every day. And again, I think this is one of these things that it's so transformative. I think we haven't even really quite internalized it yet. But I think what that means is that if when information was scarce, if the environment was essentially creating these constraints, you have to walk over to the desk to use the phone, you have to go down the street to get the newspaper. But now, if those environmental constraints aren't here, what it means is that it's kind of like you're at a buffet every day of information, and you can eat anything, but not everything. But you have to kind of define your own boundaries where you didn't have to before. In the same way, if any of you have played some of these augmented reality games like Pokemon Go, or it's a game. It's a game, but it's like, in one sense, it's a game, but it's not a game in the sense that like it's happening everywhere all the time. Usually a game is in a particular place on a field somewhere. But what this means then is you have to be the boundaries. You have to bring your own boundaries, and this is essentially a question of self-regulation. So it's kind of the abundance of information, scarcity of attention. It creates a lot of new kinds of challenges of self-regulation, and this is true at the individual level. How do I keep myself from picking up my phone when I'm bored? To the societal level, how do we kind of design our informational environment in a way that's aligned with the values of our community, our society, et cetera. So it's not just the amount of information either that's kind of caused this shift. I think it's also the speed of the information. So sometimes I use this metaphor of Tetris, where it's not just the amount of blocks off screen that are waiting to fall down is the problem. It's actually the speed at which they come, and how it overwhelms your own capacity to sort of manage them appropriately. That's when you lose the game. And so I think in a similar way, it feels like it's almost like a denial of service attack on our attention sometimes. All this information coming at us every day from all these different sources. And so it's not just the amount of information, it's the speed at which it comes as well. And this is on top of the fact that these media now in the digital world, when they're unmoored from kind of physical constraints in the same way that analog information or analog media work, they can change much more rapidly. So, you never step into the same river twice. You never use the same platform twice if it's changing every day. So we think about like how many years it took various types of media to reach 150 million users. For telephone TV, we're talking, 1 or 2 human generations there. For mobile phone, like about 14 years. Then you get into the digital era, and various kinds of media platforms, every few years, and then now it's at the point where a new app or service might come up, and within days and rapidly scale and go viral. And so, on top of these kind of challenges of self-regulation, even just fundamentals of the media that we're kind of using and expected to kind of understand how to use for our own benefit are changing under our feet. And I think this keeps us on what I sometimes call like a kind of a treadmill of competence, or maybe incompetence, where we're then kind of constantly in this state of learning about how to use the new medium, but it shifts and evolves and moves along before we ever really figure out how to fully master it for our own benefit. So it kind of keeps outrunning us, so to speak. And so, all these challenges of self-regulation that come from, information abundance, attention scarcity, I think our technologies could be really helping us mitigate those challenges a lot. But I think by and large, they tend to, I think, be amplifying those challenges rather than mitigating them. So this is going to be a very high level, kind of a 30,000-foot view of some of these trends. I know it's fairly abstract, but we'll only have a few minutes here. So one way to describe kind of this informational environment we find ourselves living in today is that, over the last 50 years or so, we've come to understand much more about the human mind, human behavior, various kind of psychological biases, vulnerabilities, whatever you want to call them. And that knowledge has come into contact with the advertising industry, or we could say persuasion industry more broadly, where, to a large extent, it was about, fulfilling people's intentions in the past, but it kind of moved into the realm of preference generation, not preference fulfillment. And then those, of course, those trends collided with this enormous infrastructure of behavioral and attitudinal measurement, experimentation, analytics that the internet has afforded. And so the collision of these 3 trends has given us this thing that has been called the attention economy, which is this environment that we live in and is sort of, just the air we breathe nowadays, it feels like, where, the services we use, and which give us a lot of benefits in many ways, are trying to kind of grab as much of our attention as possible, keep us clicking, tapping, scrolling, and they're getting very, very good at it. And this is that, and of course, the business model behind many of the most prominent digital services. And so I think this is really interesting because when we think about I think one of the interesting things about this whole space is the way we talk about these different technologies, platforms, designs, persuasive mechanisms, because we don't often talk about them for what they are, right? So if there's a company that sells bananas, we'll call it a banana company, or that sells oil, we'll call it an oil company. But when it comes to these attention, merchants, in Timur's term, we tend to call them, social media, or like we don't actually call them like what's being kind of bought and sold a lot of the time. And I think it's useful to find ways to do this more. In one sense, you could think of them as like kind of attention drills, where it's kind of an industrialized infrastructure has descended on a particular, a new deposit that's been discovered of a scarce resource. Only it's one that's in our heads this time. And then I think at the same time, there's this question of what is advertising now? I don't think there's any coherent definition of it anymore. In an information abundant world, what's the purpose of it? What kinds of psychological influence, even manipulation, should we consider acceptable as business models, given that all that information is available to us out there anyway? So this whole kind of environment, the attention economy, is essentially given us this world we live in now of pretty much ubiquitous, kind of industrialized, intelligent, and a lot of time adversarial persuasion. Because if you look at the goals that people have for themselves, and you ask them, they'll say things like, I want to spend more time with family, I want to learn to play an instrument, I want to take a trip. But in this attention economy, if you look at the goals that are actually on the dashboards, in the product design meetings, they're actually driving the design. It tends to be things that aren't nearly so useful and noble. It tends to be things like the amount of time we're spending with the product, or the amount of time, the number of clicks or taps, or the eyeballs, as it's called sometimes. So, but nobody I know actually in the world has those goals for themselves. Nobody tries to spend as much time as they can on a platform. Or if they do, I'd love to talk with them. I haven't met any yet. So I think when we talk about how this intersects then with ethics, and what the kind of the core considerations are, there's of course kind of the broad question of well-being, but I think to me this issue of autonomy, of self-determination, I think looms extremely large. And if we kind of think about the great thinkers on freedom, liberty through the ages, so like John Stuart Mill, he says the appropriate region of human liberty comprises first the inward domain of consciousness. So freedom of attention, in a way, as he's saying, is almost the first kind of freedom. He says it requires liberty of tastes and pursuits, framing the plan of our life to suit our own character. So it's kind of a tension in a wider sense, it feels like, than just what we're looking at in the moment. It's like how we manage our life, how we navigate our lives. Then I think also this is really important. He says that the liberty of expressing and publishing opinions rests in great part on the same reasons and is practically inseparable from it. And I take this to mean something kind of like, the freedom of speech depends for its operation and its coherence on the freedom of attention of the sort. So I think a lot of times these things are put at odds, like kind of freedom of experience, of attention, of freedom of speech, but they're really, I think, codependent in many ways, and part of the same kind of fundamental freedom. And so I think what he's articulating here, he didn't use these terms, but it feels to me like it's something kind of like a freedom of attention. And like if you think about how, we have many mechanisms, many laws, many principles that we've developed to help us protect freedom of speech, freedom of expression, because historically it's what was under threat. And there weren't many threats to our attention that would compare with the threats to freedom of speech. But I think now in this new environment, I think to me it suggests that a new language is needed, or at least a sort of evolving of the existing sets of languages. And I think to me, for me, this kind of way of talking about it in terms of freedom of attention has been very useful. I think another place this connects with the idea of autonomy then is going back to William James, where he talks about effort of attention as the essential phenomenon of will. And so if we're kind of the structure of our will, operation of our will in an authentic way is to some extent kind of part of the idea of autonomy. I think there's a way of talking about attention and autonomy kind of in the same breath. And so one way I've talked about this and is talking about like kind of expanding out what we think of as coming under the banner of the term attention. So, most of the time when we hear attention in kind of psychology or cognitive science context, it's people are talking about the spotlight of attention. So kind of what we're giving our immediate awareness to in that moment, what we're kind of focusing on. And so that, when a technology or a platform or a service, interrupts this, it's interrupting us kind of doing what we want to do. And it could involve things like distraction, interruption, fragmentation, disruptions to working memory, and this kind of thing. So I think we can take a look at another level of attention, which is not just about doing, but what we want to do, but being who we want to be. So this would involve questions of habits over time, of kind of living by the light of our values, pursuing longer term goals, questions of identity, social status, pettiness. Do we pursue some near-term goal that we don't actually want to pursue over a longer term goal that we do want to pursue? So kind of not just doing, but being. And so I think that, this would involve questions of, like when there are infinite scrolling feeds and that, might, keep us compelled, maybe even addicted to using them, reward mechanisms in video games, loot boxes, this kind of thing, stuff that kind of undermines not just our action in the moment, but action over time. That could be the space for this kind of conception of attention. And then I think at the deepest level, if the first two categories of attention here would be about kind of pursuing goals, who we want, what we want to do, who we want to be, the kind of the last category would be about how we come up with those goals in the first place, how we determine, in Harry Frankfurt's term, what we want to want. So second order desires or volitions, as they're sometimes known. And so this would involve things like, our processes of reflection, the degree to which we're able to use our imagination, whether that's for just, flights of fancy or imagining what it's like to be, another person who's suffering. There's a way in which imagination is the basis of moral thinking. I think that's extremely important here as well. And then I think leisure, not just for kangaroos, also for people. But, Hannah Arendt has talked about how, the founders of the United States were able to kind of put the time and attention they did into thinking about what kind of country they wanted to set up because they had a certain kind of life of leisure available to them. And so that downtime, those moments when, there isn't some information or some persuasive cue kind of rushing in to fill the space when the mind can kind of wander. And this is, I think, an extremely important part of being human. And it's also a part that then, if those spaces just get filled in with pixels and light and bits of information, I think we've missed out on a big part of what it means to be human. So those can be three categories kind of attention. The idea there is to deepen the question of what counts as attention. And so you can think of these then when technologies or anything gets in the way of those, it would be a certain type of distraction. And I've called these functional and existential and epistemic distractions. So when they interfere with our doing we want to do or being who we want to be, and then wanting what we want to want, in Harry Frankfurt's term. So I don't know, I realized there was a lot there. I kind of going through it fast due to time, but one of the main points here is that attention is sort of this central way of looking at a lot of these problems. It's an extremely useful frame, I think, and there's a long tradition in human history, of course, of this idea that what we give attention to is, in a very real sense, who we are. It's not just the content of what we're thinking about; it is who we are. And you look through religious traditions, philosophical traditions. I mean, this idea keeps recurring. And then, I think Georg Frank's essay on the economy of attention, I think he's given one of the best overviews of the entire kind of system of all this, but he calls it attention, the essence of being conscious, in the sense of both self-certain existence and alert presence of mind. He says it's the medium in which everything must be represented that is to become real for us as experiencing creatures. So if this is true, if this is the case, what's at stake is, I think, with the question of attention, and the attention economy isn't just, it's not just distraction. It's not just, getting off track momentarily. It's our ability to make our lives our own. It's our ability to live authentic lives, to write our own stories in the way we want, and for the stories of our families and those we care about. I think about the stuff, all the time, now with my kids, and one thing that I've realized, I knew conceptually, but now I know kind of practically, is like as a parent, like you can't do all this yourself. You can't respond to these entire infrastructures of kind of persuasion and attention capture yourself. We need an environment that's on our side, not one that is to a large degree kind of working against us. And so I think it's interesting to think what would it look like if we could reform all of these systems in the direction of being infrastructures of care that actually helped us, helped us develop the autonomy and imagination and capacities of our children in the way that we want to. And I think they can. This is why I got into technology. This is why I continue to be an optimist about technology. And because I think that the potential is there and the motivation is there. And I think it's just a matter of figuring out how we structure things to do it. And so when it comes to the ethics, that's what my advisor at Oxford, Luciano Floridi, he called it infra ethics. So it's the ethics of the infrastructure. And I know there's a lot here, and I won't go into this in depth, but this is kind of just one view of the kinds of systemic reform I think that are needed. It's not comprehensive, but it's the sort of thing that I think is really needed in order to push forward. Just a kind of a realignment of the system, where we're not, our attention isn't sort of just the object that's kind of being captured, but it's a sort of a resource that is being stewarded. And I think it's that stewardship of attention that ought to be the sort of alignment point of the cultural, technical, business, all the different influences that have such a strong influence in this space. And then lastly, I'll mention a few things about the questions that have been presented for this present study, just that relate to some of the things I've mentioned. So I think, again, I said the attentional versus informational framing. So, one, I think it's useful to ensure that, you look at, so like there's a lot of kind of projects that have looked at harmful content as kind of the main kind of harm, but there's another kind of harm that's about the design of the persuasive mechanisms, the influence mechanisms, like whether it's dark patterns or whatever. So, and then in the same way, not only the content of speech is sort of an issue, but looking at speech as an act in itself, not just content. I think another thing related to the language point is precision about what the objects of analysis. So this term, as I said, social media, it's used in a very broad way. As far as I'm aware, there's no kind of consensus ontology of these various kinds of media or platforms. And so I think, it's important to kind of be extra precise about these things, and also to know when is it a platform versus the business model versus the persuasive mechanism versus whatever else, like that is kind of really the thing in question and the thing being studied. So I think that, in a domain that's as emergent and evolving as this, I think it's extra precision is really important. And then I guess just maybe last thing, so I'll say direct versus systemic causation. So obviously you can never know all the effects of particular technology, but Aristotle kind of talked about efficient cause, and then formal cause was another of his four causes. So it's kind of like just the very direct kind of one-to-one effect versus the kind of second and third order effects. And then finally, kind of the role of design and intention. So really keeping that in mind in kind of the analysis. And then also, I think, thinking not only in terms of the effects of all of these systems on individuals, but on groups, whether that's families, but even communities, schools, even societies and cultures, where it's possible to kind of trace those effects at this point. So anyway, so I know that was a lot. So I hope that at least some of that resonated, and looking forward to discussing it. And so I'll just stop there and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you, James. That was terrific. We're, if I can ask you to stop sharing your screen, if you don't mind. We are going to hold questions for afterward, just to make sure we actually stay on time. And I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Piotr Sapieżynski, who is a professor at Northeastern University. Professor Sapieżynski.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. All right. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this opportunity to present our work to you today. My name is Piotr Sapieżynski. I am a research scientist at the Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute at Northeastern University in Boston. My research is on algorithm auditing. My collaborators and I study platforms to better understand how they work, how they fail, how they impact individuals and societies. And importantly, we do our work without any cooperation from the companies that run these platforms, and often despite their best efforts to prevent us from studying them. And broadly speaking, we're interested in algorithmic personalization, and we found that ads are actually a great vehicle for studying this phenomenon. But before I get into our results, let me explain how we got there and how others approach this problem. So in a very simplified view, we are looking at a system that consists of platforms, such as social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and so on. We also have creators, advertisers, and users. And on some platforms, of course, there is a significant overlap between creators and users, but let's keep it at this for simplicity. So creators and advertisers provide the platform with content that they want to share with the users. And then the platform arranges this content in a way that they predict would be most enticing to the end users. Of course, as James said, there is much more content than the users can digest, so the platforms also make a selection on how to best allocate the user's attention. And so from a perspective of a naive user, this is basically what the whole process looks like, but the next steps are crucial. So the users interact with the content that they're presented. They like it, they share it, they comment it, they bookmark it. Each of these actions is reported back to the platform as feedback. Even if the users do not take any of these explicit actions, the platform will still measure how long they spent looking at each piece of content, whether they go back to it or skip it, and so on. And in fact, online services are designed in a way that to create as many opportunities for these measurable behaviors as possible. And platforms will use all of this information to create a different selection and different ranking of content and ads for each individual user to maximize their engagement. And this is what we refer to as algorithmic personalization. And importantly, for the work that we do, the platforms share a lot of this information back to the creators and especially back to the advertisers. So minute by minute, the platforms provide advertisers with reports on how well each ad is doing, along actually with the demographic breakdowns of the audiences that are shown the ads. And so how do we go about understanding this complex system? Well, as you can see from this drawing, the platforms are obviously in the best position to understand it. They have access to all the data, they control all of the flows. But as we also know, they're not exactly willing to share this. And even if they do study themselves, they often don't share the results, so we can't really count on the platforms. And there are important studies that try to understand the relationship between content creators with the platforms and the algorithms that the platforms are running. Unfortunately, this vantage point does not lend itself to experimentation. The creators have little control over the platform's actions. They rely on their existing follower base for dissemination of content. And the information that the platforms share back to the creators is actually quite limited. On the other hand, advertisers can just pay the platforms to show whatever content they wish, and they can also specify who they want this content to go to. And so this is why many researchers approach this problem of studying personalization from the perspective of advertisers or users. And they can either do it by posing as these parties or by monitoring the content and information flow between the platform and consenting participants. So let me show you a few important results from studies like this. About 10 years ago, Professor Latanya Sweeney noticed that when she Googled her name, she would get ads that do mention her name, but often they would be accompanied with the word arrested, indicating that maybe there is some kind of criminal record associated with the name, even though she verified that nobody in the US named Latanya Sweeney has any kind of criminal record. On the other hand, when she Googled for white-sounding names, like Jill Schneider, she would get ads often from the same companies, but without indicating that there is any kind of arrest record, even if in fact people named like names that she was searching for actually did have criminal records. And so there are two hypotheses for why this could be happening. First is that the advertiser chose to phrase the ads differently based on the keywords that the user was entering. And the second is that the advertiser actually just uploaded a whole list of possible phrasing, and it's the platform, Google, and its algorithms that would choose which of the phrasing to show to get most engagement given the query. But unfortunately, from the user's vantage point, it's impossible to tell which of the hypotheses is true. In another study, Data, Chance, and Data created sock puppet accounts, which means that they created fake Google accounts that they can control all of the information about their and the behavior of these accounts. So they created, for example, an account, set the profile gender to female. They visited the 100 most visited web pages, and then they went to the Times of India to collect the ads that Google was showing on that site. What they noticed is that there were quite a few jobs quite a few ads related to jobs, including, for example, hiring at Goodwill. Then they created another account, only that now they set the profile gender to male. They went through all the same steps. They collected the ads that were being shown to them at the Times of India by Google, and they found that there were many ads that were actually explicitly for jobs that were higher paid. And again, the differences are pretty clear here. But again, from the user's vantage point, it's not possible to understand whether it was the advertisers doing this or whether it was the platform, here again, Google, predicting that this would be most engaging to the users. And to be clear, we know that advertisers can target ads in a discriminatory way. And Julia Angwin and others at ProPublica had a series of articles showing that Facebook used to allow for this old-fashioned discrimination in ads for jobs and housing. They, for example, would allow advertisers to specify gender or the age of the people that they wanted to show jobs at to, which is illegal in the US. And they even allowed advertisers to exclude people from seeing housing ads based on what Facebook inferred as was their ethnic affinity. So I alluded to this, but let's make this explicit now. There are two phases to online advertising. Phase one is targeting. This is what the advertisers are doing. They get to specify who the target audience is. And this is the phase that is more widely discussed and maybe more centered in legal discussions. We all know about the worry of micro-targeting and the advertisers exploiting sensitive attributes of users. But in fact, in most cases, the advertising budgets are not large enough to reach everybody in the target audience. And so phase two, ad delivery, becomes very important. This phase is controlled by the platform. And knowing that the budget is not enough to reach everybody in the targeted audience, the platform has to make decisions who to actually show the ads to. And so this is where our research is centered. We're coming from the assumption that maybe there is an advertiser that does not wish to discriminate or be harmful in any other way. And then the question remains, if we don't intend to indiscriminate, is it possible that there is some algorithmic optimization in phase two ad delivery that still results in discrimination? But to really answer this, one actually has to become an advertiser and run ads themselves. And this is what Lambrecht and Tucker did. They registered as advertisers on Facebook, and they paid Facebook to run this ad for STEM careers. They targeted all adults in the US. And we know from Facebook statistics that 59% of users of US adults are women on Facebook. And so naively, you could say, since this is the audience that was targeted, one would expect that that Facebook would deliver this ad to a random subset of these people. And here, importantly, as I mentioned before, Facebook shares information back to the advertiser. So as you run the ad, Facebook will tell you the demographic breakdown of the people who are being shown this ad. So as Lambrecht and Tucker collected these reports, they realized that even though the ad was targeted to all US adults, it ended up being shown to an audience that was mostly men, even though men are in a minority among Facebook users. You could say, or you could think that this is an algorithmic effect, but Lambrecht and Tucker actually posited that this is a market effect. So in the background, each ad slot is decided through an auction. And because there are many advertisers that are advertising to or targeting women specifically and not men, the market price for attention of women goes up. And so in an attempt to maximize the number of impressions that Tucker and Lambrecht would get from their ad, Facebook showed these ads more to men just because men were cheaper. And so this, they said, was purely a market effect and not an algorithmic one. So to really get at measuring the algorithmic effect, we also have to control for the market effects. And to do that, we devised this following measurement method, in that we, rather than running only one ad, we would run at least two ads at the same time. We would target them to the same audience. And in this case, we created an audience that was 50-50 men and women, as well as 50-50 white and black people. And so we run these ads at the same time, targeting the same audience. We do it with the same budget. The only thing that is different between the two ads is the job that we're advertising. And so because we're doing this at the same time with the same budget and the same target audience, we also know that these two ads are subject to the same market effects. So in this way, we control for these market effects. And with these two ads as an example, jobs in cleaning and jobs in lumber industry, we actually do see large effects. So what we're seeing here is that the job for cleaning, even though it was targeted in an inclusive way, delivered mostly to Black users and mostly to women. And on the other hand, a job that was targeted the same way and run at the same time delivered mostly to white men. And importantly, this is not just a reflection of people's true interests or qualifications for these jobs. And to show this, Alexandra, who's going to present right after me, designed an even more involved methodology, and she ran pairs of ads that require the same qualifications. So in this example, they run ads. One ad would be targeting jobs as pizza delivery driver, and the other one would be targeting advertising jobs for grocery delivery. So obviously these two jobs require the same qualifications. They're targeted at the same audience, and what they learned is that the pizza delivery job delivered mostly to men, whereas the grocery delivery ad delivered mostly to women. So even though the qualifications were the same, Facebook basically delivered them in a stereotypical way. And this is rather troubling from the societal point of view, because it appears that the delivery optimization can present different life opportunities to different groups of people, basically based on stereotypes and weak proxies. And this point becomes even clearer when you realize that even if you take two ads that advertise the very same thing, but you use different images, Facebook will deliver the ads to different segments of the targeted population. And so to test this, we ran a series of ads where each ad was pointing to the same link that was advertising a free Northeastern guide with career advice, but we changed the image that we used when we were running that ad. And so that the images that we use would imply different demographics. And what we noticed is that the images that we ran that implied people with darker, that featured people with darker skin would mostly be delivered to Black users. We also noticed age effects in that pictures of children and older people were delivered to older users, whereas pictures of adults were delivered to slightly younger users. We did not see much of an effect when we just look at gender, in that images of men and images of women were delivered mostly equally. However, when we started looking at intersections of gender and age, we noticed troubling results. In that, again, images of children and older women were delivered mostly to women, but images featuring adolescent women and young adults were actually delivered mostly to men, and particularly to older men. And this is possibly based on who historically engaged with other ads that also featured images of young women. But I want to stress here that obviously this is completely unrelated to what is actually being advertised. And this is not just about demographics. So we also registered as political advertisers. And in the run-up to the 2020 elections, we ran ads with Republican and Democratic content. We targeted an audience that was 50-50 Republican and Democratic. And we noticed that even though we targeted the two groups equally, Facebook would deliver the Republican content more to Republicans and the Democratic content more to Democrats. And again, this is troubling from the societal point of view, because that means that Facebook will preferentially show you the political messaging that they infer you already agree with. But let me take a step back here. So far, I talked about the results that we achieved when we were posing as advertisers, running ads and measuring how they're delivered. And this methodology, as I showed, let us learn quite a few things about how the platform algorithms work, but they suffer from two main limitations. The first one is that we're only able to comment on the ads that we run. And of course, we're a small drop in the ocean of advertisers on Facebook. And the second, perhaps more important limitation is that we're not really engaging with the users. So we don't really understand the experiences of people who are actually subject to these algorithms. And so to address this limitation, we started focusing more on understanding what users are experiencing. And to that end, I actually collaborated with a Polish NGO called Panoptykon. This NGO was approached by a woman who recently became a mother and had anxieties about her health and the health of her child. And she noticed that a huge portion of her Facebook ads were actually about these problems that she found distressing. And so we used this tool from NYU for collecting Facebook ads. I'm sure we'll hear more about this today, to collect all of the ads that she was seeing. And we noticed, yes, around 38% of the ads that she was seeing were about parenting, adult and infant health. We also collected the reasons that these ads were shown to her. So when a user clicks to, the user can ask Facebook, why am I seeing this ad? And then Facebook will tell the users how this ad was targeted. And what we notice is that plenty of advertising criteria were actually very sensitive, and they were about even particular diseases. So in this example, an ad was targeted with an interest in neoplasm and leukemia. And just to be clear here, this user never actually liked neoplasm or leukemia on Facebook. This is something that Facebook inferred about her from her behaviors on Facebook and outside on the internet. But what you can also see here is that when you request to see why you're seeing this ad, Facebook also suggests that if you don't like this, you can adjust your settings to personalize your ads. So we decided to see if this actually works. So this user of ours clicked through and disabled all of the targeting interests that were related to parenting, adult health, and infant health. And after a week after disabling all of these interests, the fraction of the ads that she was seeing on these topics dropped significantly to only 22%. But as we continued this observation, we saw that after a month, after she disabled all of the interests, the fraction of these problematic ads went up again to about 35%, which is very close to what it was in the beginning. We continued collecting this information from the why am I seeing this dialogue. And what we saw is that these ads were no longer targeted using those sensitive interests. So now she was seeing ads that were very similar in content. So her experience didn't really change that much. But now it wasn't the advertisers who were targeting her with her interest in leukemia or cancer awareness and so on. It was advertisers who just said, show this to women in Poland. And it was the platform that had already inferred that she would be most susceptible to this content about children and cancer. And so she kept seeing these ads. And even though she used the available tools to express that she wishes not to see these ads. So just as a few takeaways from what I presented today, I think it's pretty clear that online feeds are complex systems that require bespoke measurements. We saw that this optimization of delivery might be based on stereotypes and proxies and not necessarily based on some true meaning behind the content that is being shown. We also showed that restricting targeting criteria may not guarantee safer outcomes. So remember, all of the experiments that we were running, we were actually targeting a very inclusive audience, not really using any particular targeting criteria. And yet the platform chose to deliver this content to skewed subgroups within the targeted audience. So we can't just restrict targeting criteria. In fact, when we do this, we might actually end up giving even more power to the platforms to decide who should see which content. We also saw, based on this limited case study, that individual agency is limited. So we had a user that was motivated enough to actually go through all those available menus, click the available options and try to disable this content, and yet she kept seeing this disturbing content. And I think this all leads to the conclusion that maximizing engagement does not align with individual and societal values. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll gladly take questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Sapieżynski. We're going to hold on questions just to make sure that we have time for the next presenter, and we'll get to questions at the end. Our third speaker is Professor Alexandra Korolova at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton University. Professor Korolova.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm gonna continue where Piotr left off and talk about the challenges that we encountered while performing the successful audits that he talked about. And I'm going to start with the challenges of our approaches. Then I'm going to continue by discussing alternative auditing approaches and what challenges they face. And then I'm going to conclude with recommendations of what is needed in order to successfully perform audits of algorithmic systems. And as a reminder, we are studying ad delivery as a lens to all sorts of algorithms that prioritize content on social media. So there is a whole skew of relevance, so-called relevance algorithms that prioritize what kind of content gets displayed on the news feed, what kind of content gets displayed in search and recommendation systems, and so forth. And it's the same types of algorithms for organic content and for advertising. And so advertising is our lens into understanding those algorithms better. So as Piotr mentioned, it was first hypothesized that ad delivery algorithms may be discriminatory by Latanya Sweeney in 2013. And we finally had a definitive answer that they are discriminatory in the case of Facebook for job ad delivery by gender in 2021. So really, it took 8 years to go from a strong hypothesis to a proof. And what was needed for that is a lot of different tricks and data and so forth. So specifically what we needed to do is we needed to control for market effects, which is the trick Piotr talked about, which is running campaigns targeted at the same audience at the same time. But then we also needed to control for things like the role of user feedback. Is it really the algorithm, or is it the users who are giving feedback that these are the kinds of ads that they would like to see? And if we wanted to do this not just for gender not just for gender, but also for race, we needed to find ways to measure racial skew. And though when we wanted to do this for job ads, we needed to find ways to control for qualifications, which is an excusable cause of skew. So let me just tell you briefly what were the tricks that were needed for each of these points. And from those tricks, explain what are the challenges in auditing. So starting with controlling for the role of user feedback. How do we know whether people are seeing ads for lumberjacks versus cleaning because of the algorithm skew, or because they have previously reacted in certain ways to those jobs ads? And the trick we found here is really to make an image look the same for individuals, but to look differently for the algorithm that is deciding where to show that ad image. Specifically, we use something called opacity in images, where you can regulate how opaque it is to the point where you can make it appear like a white blank square to people, but all the data is still there and the algorithm can still use all of this data. And when we did that, we ran now a bunch of stereotypical images that were opaque. So all of these images were looking the same for individuals and differently for the algorithm. And what we found is that there's no difference in delivery between visible and invisible masculine, typically masculine ads. That is, the algorithm is deciding who to deliver the ads to based on the content, not based on the individual's responses, because to the individuals, those ads look identical, like the blank white squares. What did we have to do to measure racial skew? Facebook, who we're studying, doesn't report delivery statistics broken up by race. It only reports ad delivery statistics broken up by gender and by location. So the trick that we used is we took public voter records, which in some states contain name, address, gender of a person, and race. And we used those public records to create custom audiences with one-to-one correspondence between race and location. And then we used location as a proxy for inferring race. So to make this more concrete, so you can visualize it, imagine having voter records from Florida and voter records from North Carolina. Take the same number of people who are white voters for Florida and the same number of people who are Black voters from North Carolina, and merge them into one custom audience list. Now, run a Facebook campaign targeting this list. Whenever this campaign gets delivered in North Carolina, we know that it's delivered to a Black person. Whenever this campaign is delivered in Florida, we know that it's delivered to the white person. Then do the same with the roles reversed. Take Black voters from Florida, white voters from North Carolina, and repeat this process. And this way, you overcome the inability to know who the ads are being delivered to by race. What does this require? This requires access to voter records that have information about race. What did we need to do to control for qualifications in the experiment that Piotr mentioned? Well, we needed to find two employers who have similar qualifications requirements and who have a de facto gender skew in the real world. So for example, Domino's pizza delivery and Instacart grocery delivery, it's the same job requirement. But it just happens in the current environment that pizza delivery folks are mostly male and Instacart delivery folks are mostly female. Then we ran job ads at the same time for these two job positions to a gender balanced audience. And then we could infer that if there is a relative difference in delivery by gender, then it's not qualifications that is the source of the skew. It's really the algorithm that's the source of the skew that's propagating existing stereotypes. When we try to generalize this to other professions beyond pizza delivery, we look through hundreds of company transparency reports in order to find what are the gender skews in other professions. And we really found only two professions for which we could repeat this, for software engineers and for sales. So, and when we try to generalize this for race, in principle, the methodology works. If we can find a pair of job positions that have similar qualification requirements, but have the de facto racial skew in the real world, then we can rerun the experiments and conclude whether ad delivery is discriminatory by race. But we couldn't find companies for whom we would know what is the de facto racial breakdown for comparable positions. So we really couldn't do the analysis without more data. And that's really a theme here, that our methodologies rely on external data sources that contain very private, very sensitive data. So in the voter records case, race data is only available in some states. And moreover, the individuals are not willing participants in these experiments. Their data collected for one purpose is being used for other types of purposes. And similarly, we are limited in what we can find about current company employees. And actually now when companies are doing their own self-audits, they're also subject to this limitation. So for example, Facebook is now under a mandate by the Department of Justice to test their algorithms for discrimination. And Facebook is looking for external sources of data in order to perform these kinds of tests. And now bringing this back to the subject of this workshop, imagine we want to ask questions about impact of social media on the health and being of adolescents and children. Imagine we want to ask whether Facebook delivers unproven dieting ads to people who are already susceptible to body image issues. Then we would have to collect data about people who are susceptible to these issues and run experiments against using data of those people, which is not something that's very simple or clearly ethical to do. So that's a big limitation with our current approaches. Moreover, for the political ad delivery that we studied, there are other limitations. So when you become a political advertiser in the US, when you spend more money than a certain amount, you need to register with the Federal Elections Commission. You need to submit the quarterly reports. And when you run many tens of experiments, that's many tens of reports. Moreover, all of these experiments cost money. And the National Science Foundation and the universities, which is a typical sources of funding for researchers, are not equipped to run experiments that will then need to be reported to the Federal Elections Commission. So in this case, we ended up simply funding it from our own personal money. And again, auditing political ad delivery also requires additional data such as voter records and campaign contribution reports. So even though we were able to do the study once, and we were able to show that the ad delivery algorithm steers content to the users who already agree with it, this kind of study is very hard to do repeatedly on a consistent basis. If you want to expand to auditing on other platforms, so beyond Facebook, then there are further challenges that you face. So for example, on LinkedIn, gender statistics are not reported because they are not collected. So we have to do this location trick that we did for race now in order to infer gender, which introduces noise in the data, which introduces additional challenges in running statistically valid studies. If you want to run this with similar experiments on Twitter, then you need a different specification of audience lists. It's not enough to have the name and address of a person to create a custom audience. There are other areas in the experimentation. So for example, on Google, in order to access relevant features, the minimum spending amount is quite high. And not everybody can therefore run these kinds of experiments. Finally, all of this is very much at the whim of the platform. We as advertisers can get banned at any time. Our ads can get disapproved at any time, and there's no real recourse. And moreover, once the platforms potentially know who are the researchers running the experiments to study their algorithms, they can pay extra attention and perhaps even change the behavior of their algorithms for suspected auditor accounts. So in other words, even though Piotr showed quite a bit of success in shedding light on ad delivery algorithms, this endeavor is very creativity intensive. It's expensive. It doesn't easily generalize and requires rich data sources containing private information. And moreover, our experiments only apply to the advertising content. I started by saying, well, ad delivery is a lens into relevance algorithms generally. But taking a step back, what do we really know about ad delivery algorithms? What I've written on the left is pretty much all we know. So we know that the ad that wins an auction and gets shown in one is the one with the highest total value, which is a combination of three major factors: bid, estimated action rate, and ad quality and relevance. All of these are algorithmically determined. But even though advertising is a huge market with a lot of players who stand to benefit because there's real money involved, this is basically all that is publicly known about these algorithms. So when we move into other areas such as search ranking, video recommendations, and so forth, even less is known. There was a recent leak of Yandex source code, and we found out that there's almost 2,000 ranking factors that go into its search algorithm. We don't know much else beyond that. And the algorithms are kind of opaque in some ways by intention, because they want to protect business interests and also to prevent manipulation. But this opaqueness has the flip side of not being able to study their impact for societally relevant desiderata, for harms that they may be causing to individuals or society as a whole. What are some of the alternative auditing approaches? What else have people tried? One of the most important approaches is really through crowdsourcing. So recruiting a panel of users who will give you access to their experiences on these platforms, and then analyzing the data that you obtain from this panel of users. And this has been most recently successfully implemented by the Markup and also by Mozilla Rally. What are the challenge with this? The challenge is recruiting large-scale panels that are representative. Another challenge is that even when you succeed in recruiting a large-scale panel, you're limited mostly to browser extensions. You can barely study any of the mobile experiences. And as we all know, most of the social media use these days is on mobile. Another challenge is that it requires panelists to trust the auditor with their private information. So again, going back to the use case of relevance to this panel, it would require participants to trust the auditor with very important, potentially health and behavior data. It is also expensive because it costs money to build these tools, and it also costs money to recruit the participants. And finally, when you're running observational only studies, it's very difficult to draw causal conclusions. You can observe that perhaps these types of users are getting more of this type of content than these types of users, but it's hard to attribute cause, whether this is the algorithm or whether this is something else. Another popular approach is through so-called sock puppet accounts. So this is a technique where researchers create new accounts, carefully controlled for various characteristics, and then compare the behavior of the algorithms for these new accounts. But there's challenges with that as well. In most cases, this violates the terms of service of the companies. These sock puppet accounts typically are not representative because in social media you need to have friends, you need to have interaction context and so forth, and it's hard to do that for fake accounts. And finally, the platforms are very eager to stop that. So in order to create now accounts on major platforms, you need to verify them with a phone number. You can't get a fake phone number and so forth. So these approaches are also at kind of the limit of what they can do. And finally, all of this is also at the whim of the platform, where even when you succeed, the platforms can disable your extensions, discredit the authors of the study, and so forth. So it's a very pessimistic view on what one can do. I want to end on a positive note. The positive note, in my opinion, is going to be through legislation. There's been a lot of discussions that platforms should now support auditing, and their chief objections are that they don't want to endanger user privacy and they don't want to endanger their own business interests. But there is legislation both in the European Union and in the United States that is pushing forward for mandating platforms access. Specifically, the Digital Services Act in the European Union is law and will be enforced in 2024 and will require regular audits. And there's a question of, is it possible to protect users' privacy and platforms' business secrets while providing meaningful ability to audit? And we have recent work that shows that it's possible to do that for when you study these relevance algorithms, that it's possible to build a platform supported auditing frameworks that has safeguards for privacy and that is at the same time generalizable to different types of bias and harms and to different demographic groups and different platforms. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the details, but there is some hope for a realizable auditing system that should work for all types of relevance algorithms. In conclusion, I believe that in order to understand social media roles, we really need to focus on the relevance estimator algorithms and what their impact is. And from the scientific perspective, there are many questions of how you get additional data for controlling for various factors, such as developing new methods for auditing with noisy data, recruiting participants willing to contribute their data, and also leveraging existing sources of data, such as the US Census Bureau. And from a practical perspective, I believe that regulation is really the lever that can support all of these efforts and that can provide protection for public interest research, that can mandate transparency, that can mandate platform supported auditing, and that can also provide funding for research. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions in the question and answer session discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. If I may, thank you, Alexandra, Piotr, and James. We're on time, so now we have 30 minutes for questions with the speakers. I'll open it up to the committee members. I'll ask people just raise their digital hand, and we'll go from there. Jeff, why don't we start with you?
Thank you to all the speakers for sharing with us. And mine's for Alexandra and Piotr. I'm a huge fan of algorithm audits. I'm really glad that you shared all this with us. My question would be, imagine a world that would be the best for algorithm audits, and I'm curious what you think it would be. So here's a vision as an example. We create a new department at the government. It's the same level as, say, the Treasury, and in the same way that the Treasury has employees and officers working inside banks that are constantly, auditing banks because they're considered vital to, U.S. national interests. And so these banks must cooperate. So that's a vision which I'm imagining would be really difficult to pull off. But I'm curious what you would imagine would be the ideal environment for doing these audits that would allow us to, hold platforms accountable, but also when they're working well to sort of like recognize that things are working well. The same way that banks can work great, but also can be bad actors. Either of you would be great, whoever wants to talk about it.
Would like to take that on.
Alexandra, I think you should start.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. This is a great question. I like your vision. I think creating an entity supported by the government that would enable such audits is the way to go. I think we need to be careful that this data is not co-opted for other purposes besides the audits. I think we need to be careful as to who gets access to the data. So I don't think it should be limited to only professors and universities, because there are other people such as journalists who have wonderful ideas as to what are the important questions to look at. So it needs to be available more broadly. I think there's also a question of an incentive structure, right? As this kind of, it's a feedback loop, right? Like the platforms will get more clever in hiding stuff. So the auditors will also need to get more clever. So there needs to be an incentive structure, perhaps in academia, where this kind of work is also rewarded and attracts the best talent. So there are many questions, but I think that's ultimately one of the directions to go.
Anybody else from the panel would like to address that?
I agree with everything that Alexandra said. I would also want to add that there is this tension between aiming for accountability in that we don't do these audits just out of curiosity because we want to know how things work, but in the end, we want to push for actual change. When we see discrimination, we would hope that something can be done to combat the discrimination, either by fixing the algorithms or just taking them down altogether if there is no clear path toward fixing them. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure that as we strive for standards and accountability, we don't want to limit the domain in which we're doing the audits. So there's probably quite a bit of push from the companies to limit what kind of things are being audited. And so, you know, I talked a lot about discrimination by gender and race, but then there is also other effects that are not necessarily demographic. The content that is being shown specifically to people that are susceptible to it doesn't necessarily have to go along demographic lines. And so we should also be careful that as we push for standardization, we don't limit the range of problems that we are looking at.
Let me, Sharon, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that and I'll come to you. Can I just ask you to comment, you're talking about standardization. Can I ask any of the panelists to comment on how realistic is regulation oversight, standardized oversight of a lot of these channels of communication and advertising? Where is, you know, you all are immersed in this world. Where is the world at in terms of realistically moving to such efforts? Anybody?
I think it's more realistic than one would think. So in particular in Europe, it is becoming law, Digital Services Act. So it's a matter of whether it's going to be applied to what algorithms will this be applied. But it is realistic. Of course, it's in the US, there is a proposal of the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act that has been introduced in Congress. So it is realistic. It's a question of what are the forces in play. Do we have people who will do these audits? Do we have people who will further push the US proposals while counteracting the policy effort, the lobby efforts of the platforms? And I think it's possible.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Sharon, with you.
Thank you. Thank you for a set of great presentations. So my question, the first part Jeff asked, the first part was about sort of who gets to audit and who gets to see what's happening and what's the role that regulation plays there. But I do have one sort of additional question there. I think it was more about like opening access. But Alexander, as you also have mentioned, these are really complex tasks that are like, I think it's no accident that only a few universities are sort of carrying these out. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about the role that regulation or the governments or these sort of higher level institutions can play in making such research sort of more possible. It might be like infrastructural help, support and things like that. These kinds of things that you have been developing over time. So that's the first part. The second part was about once we know something is out there, what to do about it. And Piotr, you started addressing that. But one specific question I want to ask there is, for instance, in your presentations, you're sort of focused on one thing as society we care about, which is sort of equality and also autonomy. But I'm thinking of some studies that are talking about sort of costs of fairness, if you will, of thinking through there might be various things that you might want to optimize for, like equality, but also getting people to, like employment, if you're trying to maximize employment, as I don't want to necessarily take the position, but one can take the position that targeting can be good in getting the numbers up there. So I'm curious, how do we think about when we have the results that we have, who gets to decide when something is right or wrong? And is that, again, part of institutions that we need to build? What do we do with the results of the audits that we have, given the complexity of various things as societies we're trying to improve?
Who would like to tackle that? James, you haven't jumped in. Would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think, I think this whole kind of area of regulation and audits, I mean, to me, like, I think there's the higher up we go in terms of kind of like the design goals, I think the higher leverage we are, and then I think the easier it is. So for instance, today, like, I mean, we could mandate that tomorrow, companies, you know, apart from looking at the mechanisms of the algorithms or anything like that, just look at the goals that are actually already in the systems, already on the dashboards that are being optimized for. And that would be fairly trivial probably to require of companies at a certain size or level of power, not even just companies, any kind of, you know, system. So I think that there are things that could be done like that before we even get into the kind of the nitty gritty of things like that. I think there's also an opportunity to sort of explore different frames for, you know, if we do have a sort of standard that we want the outcome of an algorithm or design to meet, whether it's, you know, equality, fairness, or wherever we say that the point of the system is, we could reframe it. So for instance, like, you know, another way that a lot of these things kind of get found is by what we now call like whistleblowers, right? People who have a certain kind of, they see it internally in an organization and then have and kind of a response that you know, this isn't right. But like, what if we were to sort of have some kind of, you know, a more developed process around that and reframe it as, you know, ethical bug reporting or something like that, where it's sort of less adversarially framed and more kind of you know, constructively framed. So I think there could be things like that could be explored too. But I think it seems to me like it's a space where there's a lot of opportunity for trying out different ways of talking and thinking about it.
Thank you. Miguel.
So I'd like to ask James. So, you know, you eloquently put this trade-off between the freedom of attention, right, and you know, what, trying to find the best ways to get at information, right? But you know, we're tasked to address issues on childhood and teenagers, right? So at the end of the day, this is a population where we for many reasons don't let them to act on their agency fully, right? So their freedom is in some way different from an adult, right? So in that sense, I would like to hear your take on how this trade-off between freedom of agency and you know, the availability of information and how harmful that information can be actually can be applied to this kind of population where agency is not 100% you know, on their hands.
James, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think my computer took its own agency on itself. So, yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's maybe in some ways the question is easier when it comes to kids. In some ways, it's harder. So I think, I mean, it's to some degree easier because then it's like, you know, there's less autonomy that they have themselves, and you know, parents make certain kinds of decisions for them. So the sort of the boundaries of their agency are, like you said, smaller. But I think it's more challenging because, you know, they're sort of learning how to be human, they're developing their autonomy. And I'm not a developmental psychologist or anything like this, but you know, but my understanding is that, you know, the kinds of environments that are good and useful for kids, you know, with respect to kind of their autonomy, their agency, is when the environment is set up to kind of reward, you know, self-control, to reward kind of those exercises of willpower or whatever. And so I think, I mean, you know, I think it would be a really interesting project to kind of think what would that ideal environment look like using the kinds of capabilities and affordances that digital tools give us. You know, maybe it's kind of having, you know, it's having devices that are just like kind of task specific instead of kind of a general purpose device that kids are using, or so, you know, closing off those doorways of temptation to go to the, you know, the other application in the system or something. So I think it's figuring out ways in which you just could align the affordances of the system with the developmental needs. But again, that's not my expertise. I don't know if I'd be able to speak super intelligently to what those would be specifically.
Jeff?
Yeah, this will follow up on some of James's point, but is for the audit folks again. We're focusing on adolescents here, and just wondering if either of you see any issues or particular, things that we would need to think about doing algorithm audits with children, adolescents from 10 through 18.
I think that there's a range of issues, some of them Alexandra pointed to. So mainly it's the fact that we do rely on external sources of information that are, first of all, more widely available for adults. And second of all, there's fewer ethical problems with using this information than if it was data about children. At the same time, we do know that adolescents are a major fraction of the TikTok user base. And we can also see some of these methods that we have been deploying, we can actually apply to TikTok to study how the platform delivers content, the content to younger users. At the same time, like Alexandra mentioned, there is additional safeguards that we'll be implementing to make sure that these studies don't do more harm than informing us of how the algorithms work. But I do have to say that for now, none of our work is specifically focused on adolescents.
Can I ask a follow-up? I'll go back to sort of to what's pragmatic and realistic, if I may, to any of the three of you. And I realize this is a little bit out of what the three of you presented on, but can you comment on your thinking about how pragmatic and realistic it would be actually to introduce to gateway access differently by, let's say, children under 18 versus over 18, given the fluidity of access to digital ways of communication through multiple sources? Because I feel like we have heard from a number of people as a committee, and it certainly is not clear to me that there's consensus on that. I'm just curious what you all think. Like, is it actually realistic to say that people under 18 will be allowed, I'm going to use the term intentionally, to intersect with the social media in a particular way, while everybody else will intersect in a different way? Is that something which we should even consider in the realm of possibility?
Well, I mean, I would say we can look at other media for guidance. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a binary thing. Like, so if you think of movies, right, there's the rating system in movies. And so it's kind of like enhancing parents' capacity to then implement that on their own. It could be that, or it could be, it could be something that empowers local communities, because I understand that, like, kind of, if you can intervene at the level of like a whole school or a community, that's one way of doing it. So I think it's an interesting question. Where would it need to be kind of a family thing, or is it a community thing, or is it a design thing? And it seems to me like there's probably not one general answer to that for all forms of digital media. It would also depend on kind of what the ultimate purpose of it is at the end of the day. So I feel like it would be there'd be a highly specific response answer to that in different cases.
Helpful, thank you. Piotr or Alexandra, anything else you want to add to that?
I agree with James that it doesn't have to be kind of binary, and we can take ideas from other means. I also think that it's realistic to demand that platforms offer different kinds of algorithms for adults versus the children and adolescents. So it's realistic to demand that they offer different experiences, and that individuals could themselves select whether they wanted the experience of an adult or an experience of a child and adolescent. And then it would be up to the parents or the children and adolescents themselves to decide whether they want to experience a nicer, for lack of a better word, experience that is more protective of what they see than not.
Is that does that happen already with content providers, say like Netflix? Like, when Netflix has a family account, you have an account for, you can create one for children. It's not clear to me exactly what they're doing with that. Is there actually a change in the algorithm they're using, presumably for things they're recommending?
I don't know. So there are, for example, there's YouTube and YouTube Kids, but whether it's a different algorithm running in the background, I don't know that.
Can I ask just one follow-up question on that, Alexander? Because one of the things that alarmed me from your presentation is I was having this moment when I'm hearing you present and trying to think, does anybody actually fully understand these algorithms enough, period, to be able to be as deterministic as something like this would suggest? Because you were showing these sort of, the results of these experiments was all very elegant. If suppose for a second that one were to say that one wants social media companies, broadly writ, to have different algorithms for under 18, over 18. My question is, are these algorithms transparent enough even to them to be able to actually implement a change that would be meaningful? Like, or are these getting so complicated and there's so many different layers that it would be actually hard to get to sort of a, the simple level? I think I know what you mean, under 18, over 18, but practically, is that actually doable?
I think you're absolutely right. Those algorithms are incredibly complex. And it's not just the algorithm, it's the data that it's trained on, and so forth. It is the user feedback. So they are incredibly complex. I don't think anybody necessarily understands the whole thing. But that doesn't mean that it's not possible, right? These companies have some of the best engineers and so forth. So if this was a goal, I think it's an achievable goal. And one can look at what are the algorithms optimizing for, and one can develop the metrics that are important to keep track in order to make sure that the experiences are in one way versus in another way. So I think it's possible to do. It's a matter of, dedicating resources and brain power to it.
Thank you, it's very helpful. So the machines don't necessarily have to win. Okay. Sharon.
Thank you. So let's see, I have two questions. One of them is a very direct follow-up to this, but it may be narrower. So I'll go to the other one, which is a question to James. James, I really love this idea of that you were describing in this space of freedom of attention. The part that I'm struggling with a little bit is, like, it seems to me that the freedom that you're defining is very much defined at the individual level, where a lot of these things that we like, identity or our wants, our, who we are, is socially constructed. So it seems to me forget about the platforms, we already are in spaces where we're not necessarily in full control of these kinds of questions. So I think you could get into this a little bit with, like, thinking through advertisement and like the role that plays. Maybe we don't really want that. We're okay with having our peers in some shape or form shape our attitudes and behaviors. But I'm, I guess, curious about how to cleanly separate that when I can have my friend who's influenced by advertising, who's influencing me, and things like that. So I guess if you can elaborate on this question of, like how do you define this freedom of attention, and does it have to be at the individual level, or how do we account for the fact that we are living in societies where these are social constructs that shape our attitudes and behaviors?
Sure. Yeah. No. It's a really fascinating question. I mean, I think I absolutely, like, we don't kind of start just from a blank slate, and I think your question gets at kind of this issue of authenticity. How do we, when are we doing something that is authentically us, authentically our own, choice? And one of the most interesting things I've seen in studying all these different technologies in the last several years is the ways in which different cultures, cultural contexts kind of mediate the technological use and effects and different things like that. And I think there's some really interesting, like, kind of research on this that it could be done. But I mean, it's hard to say. So this is one of the things I mentioned at the end of my presentation, where it's kind of like, focusing not just on the individual in terms of the effects, but then, like, the group effects, and whether it's dyadic or family, social group, and even the way that a lot of kids start using these technologies is because one of their friends is using it, right? So I think that there's that component, but and so you would never, even if, like, some people might say, like, oh, ads don't affect me because I never see ads, I use ad blocker. But it's like, their friends, like you said, their friend might use see ads, and then everybody's talking about it around the water cooler, and and they have to be like, you know, what's that? And then they Google it. And so I think that like this question of, but I think this question of authenticity that kind of you're getting at is, I mean, it's a hard question philosophically, and it's, you know, there is this kind of idea or this term that has been used of kind of mechanism ownership, I think. So if we say like, you know, can someone consent to be persuaded of something that they didn't already think or didn't already want to do? And this idea that like, well, they could if the mechanism by which they relate to that influence, they would endorse. So I think this gets at the way in which our relation with the system and the kinds of back and forth we have with it are transparent or in the foreground versus in the background. And so this relates, of course, to some of the auditing and transparency kind of questions. But to me, like I think like one of my heuristics is like I should be able to ask any system that's shaping my life why it's designed a certain way, and I should be able to get an answer. It's actually fun to try with like the chat GPT and all this kind of these chatbots that are coming out. Like, sorry, I can't answer that and this sort of thing. But so I think it's about the way in which we kind of relate on an ongoing basis with it, how it's able to answer our questions why, and the degree to which we're able to at least provisionally endorse the kind of mechanisms of influence that it has over us. But there's a whole lot there beyond that as well.
Sharon, you said you had one other question.
Yeah, that is maybe, I don't know if it's too much in the weeds. A question to Piotr. So the study that you mentioned with the mom of the kid with cancer and the changes in the targeting behavior. So there, I'm a little bit. So I thought the explanation is that her sort of behavioral characteristics are sort of what is making it jump back up. But then I'm curious as to why it went down, if because the behavioral characteristics probably are stable. So I wonder if it's sort of indicating something worse on the side of the platform, like, oh, let's just tone it down for a week and let's see if you know she'll be fine with that. So like I wonder if it's getting at something more problematic. And again, maybe if you can comment on if that is maybe the case, like thinking about designs that reveal, like those kinds of things seem to me that we would all agree that we should handle that. Like it is, there's something worse happening there. So yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts there, both for that particular study and the implications of what kind of studies will reveal what kind of problems, sort of more, you know, actively pursued bias versus not.
I think it's a fantastic question, and I wish I had a good answer to it. I do not know why it initially went down. We are going to try to study this with a larger sample of users so we can better understand these effects. And yes, just like you said, this is about some set of behaviors that were observed of that user, both on Facebook and offline, that Facebook then inferred that this kind of content is the way to keep her attention to come back to Facebook and get more. As I also said, the system is complex. It's hard to study this, and especially it's very hard to draw conclusions from just a single case. But I hope to be able to get back to you in a couple of months when we have better answers to this. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take last two questions, one from Leslie, one from Stephanie. Leslie. I think you're still on mute, Leslie. Maybe it's the volume on your computer. Okay, we'll go ahead. Stephanie, why don't you go ahead, then we'll come back to Leslie.
Thanks. It's very interesting. I find like it's you came up with very clever ways. It's almost like the mice trying to describe the elephant, right? Like the glimpses you can get in different ways. But I'm really interested in sort of what is known or what is needed to know more about how algorithms are shaped by others, like your peers' activities, equity issues when you have fewer devices and you share them. I don't know, like if there's any research that's there or needed, or kind of where that sits at this space. You know. Anyone?
I don't know. I am not aware of any research like this. I think this then also ties back to some of the problems that Alexandra mentioned, which is that the models that we create are pretty simplistic. So we have those ham-fisted ads that are obviously designed to skew in one way or another, just so we can get the maximum effect out of the algorithm, so we can see if something is happening there. And trying to understand what you're describing is basically more realistic and more involved scenarios, which might be better observed through those observational studies like the Markup and NYU are doing, where we're actually looking at the transmissions with real users rather than made up scenarios. But then on the other hand, it is difficult to draw these causal effects or claim causal effects, because we can't control for everything else that's happening with the users. So even though that would be very interesting to study, and obviously social networks are built on top of the idea of a network and how people interact, so that should have a huge influence on what's actually happening in people's feeds. So far, I don't think that there is any clear research results on that. If there are, I would love to know about them.
Very good. Leslie, are we?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're
Perfect.
on.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in this whole idea, and James maybe, but anybody can answer, around influence and the being on the outside and being on the inside. And so, you know, we can look as well as we can, but it's kind of flawed looking from the outside and not understanding what the true motives are and why they're doing, because, you know, we could have rules, but you could always have an algorithm underneath those rules that are still getting at what their underlying wish is for what, you know, what they want to deliver, how they want to deliver it on these platforms. And so I was curious, is there any push in your fields or any opening to push for having some sort of independent expert, because you couldn't just have anybody, but independent kind of community expert watch group or, you know, board that actually gets to see some of these algorithms? And I know individuals sometimes can work, you know, with like Facebook, but I don't know that they to some of that information. Is that at all something that's afoot or trying to happen, so people can really look at this from the inside and see, you know, when the influence or the ethics of something seems to be crossing a line, people can find out?
I mean, I think there are certainly calls to have more auditing, more transparency around algorithms. I'm not aware of kind of any kind of that it seemed to have reached that tipping point of kind of broad acceptance or anything like that. I mean, maybe the other panelists might know of some. I mean, in terms of kind of just the overarching design goals that the algorithms are optimizing for, I mean, I've kind of been calling for it for a while, and in part because it seems it's a much simpler project too than just optimizing for the auditing the algorithm themselves. I mean, one thing that I think is really interesting to try to call for is, you know, like it's interesting how few companies measure their mission statement, which is presumably the whole point of the company, right? But much less kind of like than operationalize it. And to me, there's like kind of, I think, an interesting conversation there that could happen, which there ought to be already, you know, alignment on doing that. So I think that would be one thing, but I'm not aware of any kind of broad take up on this point yet. But maybe the other panelists might know of some examples.
Piotr, I see your hand up. Do you?
Yes, I just wanted to add to this that these are socio-technical systems, so it's not enough to just be looking at the algorithm or the source code or the data that it's using, but it's very important to be looking at the system. So it's you know, any kind of discrimination, harm is not written into the source code of any of these things. These are just the effects of the interaction between the machine and how people are using it, and what the machine is trying to achieve out of this interaction with people. So it's not enough to, you know, have a person that looks at the algorithm. Reading the source code won't really tell you much. It really is about observing the entire system and the outcomes for people rather than just the code and the data.
Very good. Well, I want to say thank you very much to Piotr, Alexandra, James. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for really, really interesting presentations. Thank you to everybody who's joined on this portion of the webinar. We're going to take a 13-minute break. We'll resume at 3:05 Eastern. You can log off or log back on, or just simply mute your camera and your microphone. We'll talk in 30 minutes. Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to turn this over to Professor Julianne Holt-Lunstad, professor at Brigham Young University, member of the panel, who is going to be introducing the speakers and facilitating for next hour. Julianne, over to you.
Thank you so much. As just mentioned, my name is Julianne Holt-Lunstad, and I'll be moderating the panel discussion on advertising transparency. And so we will be hearing from Damon McCoy, Associate Professor of Computer Science and Engineering from Tandon School of Engineering at New York University. We'll also be hearing from Jenny Radeski, Associate Professor of Pediatrics from the University of Michigan Medical School. And then finally, we'll hear from Ari Waldman, a Professor of Law and Computer Science at Northeastern University and the Faculty Director, Center for Law, Information, and Creativity. So I want to first start with Dr. McCoy. Earlier today, we heard about the way algorithms that control the ads people see on social media. Your position has been that it is important for society that researchers be able to access data about social media and the algorithms that shape people's experiences of it. Can you tell us about your experience as a researcher who studies these ads and what you might see as a more productive way forward?
Sure, yeah. So I'll just quickly sketch kind of my experience or my group's experience in trying to audit the transparency mechanisms and also trying to audit the ads that are run by these social media companies within here. And kind of my journey began before, our attempts to audit this. There had been other attempts, but these attempts had been very small scale and gotten very few ads within there. And so what changed and why my group started doing this was that in 2018, after the election interference came to light, the social media companies pledged to make political advertising more transparent on their systems within there. And so, naturally, I was a little bit piqued in terms of curiosity as to what would come about from this. And so we started looking at these transparency mechanisms within here, and we could quickly see that, as opposed to some of their other systems, like the systems that they use to collect money from their advertising systems, they had not invested much in these transparency mechanisms within there. And so it took quite a bit of engineering effort to get the actual online ad data out of these systems within here. And we kind of quickly became the kind of unwanted QA team for these political transparency systems within here, where we kind of had this tenuous relationship with the platforms where we'd go to them privately saying there were issues with their transparency systems. They, would sometimes respond, but oftentimes they wouldn't respond. And then we would kind of have to go to the press. There would have to be a big press article. And then finally, the platforms would improve their transparency systems within here. And we went through several iterations of this, trying to push them to invest more in their transparency systems, trying to get them to improve their transparency systems more within there. But there were some pieces of data that they weren't willing to make transparent within here. In particular, Facebook, now Meta, was not willing to make the targeting criteria that the advertisers provide to them transparent to these mechanisms within here. And so, as other previous people said, the other option is to try and do crowdsourcing, where you recruit participants and they give you this information, because Facebook, Meta provides this information to users when they're seeing their ads within here. And so we built the system to, crowdsource this advertising within a year, and through the combination of the political data that the platforms were sharing and this targeting information, we began to build systems that began to find large-scale misinformation campaigns, scams, whatnot, within a year. And then again, oftentimes we would go to the platforms and they would do nothing when we privately reported these within a year. Like, for instance, we found that Xinhua News, the Chinese state-sponsored news agency, consistently was running political ads on US political topics, but not following the disclosure rules within there. And Facebook, it did not appear, was enforcing on them in any way within there. So we would report these kind of things to the platforms. Privately, they oftentimes wouldn't do anything until the journalists started reporting on these things within here. And so right before the run-up of the 2020 political elections, we were running our tools, we were finding the disinformation campaigns, and Facebook served us with a cease and desist letter to stop our collection of the targeting information within there. And so this set off a bunch of lawyers, a bunch of squabbling within there. Over the summer of 2021, Facebook ultimately terminated our access to the other data that they had gone to Congress saying that they had made transparent within there. So they terminated one of my PhD students, our lead engineer, and my access to that data and our personal Facebook accounts as well within there. And so this kind of shows this limits of this self-regulation in terms of transparency, I feel, within here. And so I think through this experience that we've gone through, we realized, as other people have said, that we need regulation within here. And in the EU, we have the Digital Services Act. And so in 2024, all advertising will be made transparent in the EU within there. And researchers will also be given access to the algorithms, like those ad delivery algorithms that were discussed before within there. And I feel like we need legislation like this in the US within here. The other thing, this experience has taught me is that we need safe harbor laws for researchers as well, to make it so that we're not taking on as much risk within here, because as researchers, we face the risk of our institutions being sued, but also personally being sued as well within here. And so it'd be nice to have regulation in terms of safe harbor and universal ad transparency and access to these algorithms to study them more. So that will wrap it up for me.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'd like to hear next from Dr. Radesky. Social media and the online world more broadly is built on advertising. And this is an observation that you have made in some of your work. Can you tell us more about what you have found about advertising in apps and video sharing platforms for young people? And specifically, what are the unique concerns about advertising to children?
Sure, and I'm going to share my screen just with one slide. Well, it's one slide that comes in 3 slides, but I wanted to first explain why I focus on marketing and advertising as a really critical mechanism, linking users' experiences and the design of technologies. I'm really interested in this for a couple of reasons. One is I'm a physician, so I'm really interested in the complex systems that surround kids and their families and determine their starting points and their opportunities. So I care about the educational system, the behavioral healthcare system, and the digital ecosystem, because the design of the digital environments where kids are spending their time is going to shape their opportunities and their starting points. So the default decisions that occur when they enter a video sharing platform or an app, what are they offered first? Are they offered opportunities to explore and then disengage at will, or are they offered, nudges and closed loop constraints? Those are the sorts of things that I find really fascinating, and trying to, in my research program at U of M, merge together human computer interaction research and collaborations with my more developmental behavioral pediatric lens. The second reason I really care about marketing and advertising is that one of the research methods I use is this. It's passive sensing, where we track kids' tablets or phones, and we track parents' tablets and phones too. I focus on early childhood. So this is a couple of kids' outputs from their 3 and 4-year-olds. We followed their tablets or phones with a passive sensing app that we developed for Android devices. And we're able to see objectively, like exactly what apps they're using at what minutes. And these are hourly summaries of, on a typical day, what are these children using? And what we found when we looked at what kids are using, it's really dominated by these big platforms that are monetizing time or engagement through advertising. So lots of general audience apps, that's the bright yellow, lots of YouTube and YouTube Kids, and lots of streaming video as well. Not as much, I work with the American Academy of Pediatrics. We were looking for how much they're video chatting their grandparents, how much are they using really highly educational apps, and that was much, much less of their time. So considering that kids are spending a lot of time in these heavily monetized environments, we've started downloading and playing all these games ourselves in our lab. So we're coding for content of like, how often are ads occurring? And these are not the sort of discrete 30-second TV spots that a lot of prior research on kids and advertising and related policy was based on. This is ads that could be embedded in really different ways in the user experience. It could be a parasocial character like strawberry shortcake, making pressure on the user to make purchases. And we know that kids are more susceptible to someone that they either identify with or really trust through a parasocial relationship with a media character. We found ads disguised as or linked to rewards, and that matters because if you are a young child or a teen, you may be more reward sensitive based on your developmental stage. We found lots of strategically timed ads that would just pop up if you were trying to exit out of the app, and a lot of age inappropriate ad content. So these ad networks were clearly, to little kids games distributing ads that were like for wine or for bipolar treatment. So it really seemed kind of like a sloppy environment in which kids were playing and their time and activity was being monetized. We've gone on to also linking the data from the kids that we've followed in this cohort. We've looked at the apps that they're playing and found that the lower socioeconomic status children were playing apps that have more manipulative design that encourage purchases, prolonged gameplay, or ad viewing, and also more collection and sharing of private identifiers. So all these different levels of the marketing infrastructure of the apps and games and platforms that kids are using are kind of being inequitably distributed amongst kids from different backgrounds. We've also taken a deep dive into YouTube because it is just taking up the largest proportion of time of most of the apps that kids are using. So with Common Sense Media, we've asked kids to submit their viewing histories, and then my team just watches them all and codes them for things like the ad load, which was highest in the early childhood videos, for things like low educational quality, highly commercial content with kidfluencers kind of promoting their own toys. We've counted the appearance of racial and ethnic diversity, which is quite low. And we've also started to look at how the thumbnails in these recommendations grids are trying to encourage click-through through tapping into sort of fast-brain heuristics, like gender stereotypes, violence or prank themes, or lavish excess. So I just wanted to give a quick brief view of the research we've tried to do, that we're trying to see what a child would see when they enter these spaces, right? What would they be offered first? How have these spaces been designed to optimize for metrics that matter in an ad system based on advertising, right? So if your metrics are more engagement or more data collection or more time on device, it makes sense that what we're seeing as we enter these spaces is more things like rewards for more ad engagement, or prompts or navigation constraints that keep kids playing longer. But it also makes sense that some kids are struggling within that ecosystem, since it wasn't designed with their unique needs in mind as a first principle. So I would just end by suggesting that the researchers involved in this panel, or who've been involved in this study altogether, it would be great if we could come up with new metrics that really reflect children's well-being so that design could be optimized for that. Because right now what we're encountering is lots of ad design that really seems to either be kind of sloppily distributed to youth or is kind of specifically targeting some of children's vulnerabilities that make them more likely to engage with ads.
Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to hear from Professor Waldman. Some of your work has exposed how tech companies translate information about their users into advertisements, even scanning users' private messages to collect data for advertising. Can you explain the company's arguments that users agree to this by accepting the terms of use? And can you explain the forces that drive this surveillance?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me on this panel. Thanks for that great question. Really wonderful to be here with such excellent researchers and people who I've cited before and told Damon's story before as well to others. So that's great. It's great to be here. So really this question is about the nature and failures of consent. The pressures here are entirely capitalistic, but it's also very easy for a company to say, well, by virtue of you having used this website, or by virtue of you clicking this agree button, or by virtue of you failing to click to toggle a button, or by virtue of the fact that your parents consented, or that your parents said it was okay, or that you clicked a button saying that there was a parent present. What consent does at scale, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a second, is that it operates as a kind of a get out of jail free card. Normally, when most of us think about consent, we think about it in a very empowering way. We talk about consent with our patients, doctors in the room. We'll talk about, or MDs in the room. We'll talk about consent with their patients. You read a long list, or you understand a long list of complications for surgeries, and then you discuss it with your advocate, you discuss it with your family, and discuss it with your doctor, and then you consent to this procedure. And in fact, we have tons of laws that hold medical professionals responsible when they don't get sufficient consent. But imagine having to go through that entire process of getting informed and voluntary and free consent when every single app, every single page, every single website, every single thing you might do online has its own toggle button or has its own agree button. And it's simply impossible, whether you give up because you're fatigued, or you become nihilistic about the process, thinking that, well, there's absolutely no way that I can handle this for the 500 apps that I have on my phone and the hundreds of websites that I visit on a weekly basis. So let's just give up. I might care about care about my privacy or care about not being targeted, but there's nothing I can do about it. And companies will say to that when confronted with the realities of the failures of consent at scale, companies will respond in one of two ways. They'll say, well, people say that they care about privacy. Kids too, say that they care about privacy, but they don't act like it. We call this the privacy paradox. And the reality is that we don't give people the tools to be able to act like it. As previous speakers were talking about, both in this panel and previously, the entire system of the surveillance economy online is built to manipulate us to do more stuff, to engage more, and therefore provide more fodder for virtual profiles and digital dossiers that are used for profit. So the fact that people do care about privacy, even if they do end up giving away information for small rewards, that's not a meaningful data point to suggest that people don't actually care about privacy. They do. It's just that industry, and the law has allowed industry to do this, industry has designed an internet ecosystem that perfectly manipulates everyone into giving up their data and doesn't allow them to do anything else. The other response that they offer is that, well, targeted advertisements are good. And to a certain extent, we understand the benefits of targeted advertisements. Those of us who live, let's say some of us live in New York City, we might want to hear about a sale or a new restaurant near us that we're more likely to visit than something that we have no chance of actually using. So there are also distributional benefits to hearing about for targeted advertisements. Consider a single parent who's working multiple jobs in order to get their food, in order to put food on the table for their family. They want to be able to see the sales and see opportunities for things that they buy all the time. They want free shipping. They want to be able to gain access to those materials and those tools really fast. There are benefits to targeted advertising, but the fact that there are benefits does not necessarily mean that targeted advertising should exist in a regulatory void or should exist without any systems or systems that control it or limitations on it substantively. So immediately we could immediately toss in the idea, well, you shouldn't be able to target to kids. That's low-hanging fruit. There obviously, I don't think we should be able to, companies should be allowed to target to kids for profit. And we certainly shouldn't be using a consent-based regime like we do in the United States to target kids for profit. That's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is almost entirely a consent-based regime, but that's at a minimum, right? Company rhetoric about the benefits of targeted advertisements are used as kind of a shield for all types of regulation. And it's great that we're seeing research done to pierce that kind of shield, because we need real substantive and structural reform of the surveillance economy generally, not just one focused on children.
Thank you all so much. I know you've given me so much to think about, and I know that we're going to have an opportunity to have the committee ask questions. But first, I want to ask a question of all panelists. Since our committee is specifically interested in young people's relationships with social media, could each of you offer any comments on what you would want young people to be aware of as they use these platforms, specifically regarding how their interaction with advertising affects them individually and affects society?
I can start. And I've thought a bit about this with our work at the AAP Center of Excellence on social media and mental well-being, which I'm co-medical director of with Megan Moreno. So we have really been thinking about how to pull the curtain back a little bit so that families, especially younger kids, I think that kids even, ages 7 to 11 are fascinated by this. They really want to know why they're recommended certain things, why ads appear at certain times, why influencers are flexing the way they are or making them feel worse about themselves, why different content creators behave the way they do. And the more you explain the kind of mechanisms underlying the platforms that they love, they like that. They feel more empowered in making the sort of choices that make them feel like they're getting the most out of that platform, and that they're meeting their, to go back to the earlier talks, they're meeting their kind of autonomous, agency-driven interest in engaging with that platform, rather than feeling like they were taken somewhere they didn't really plan to go. So I think that all of the different levels of the marketing, from the specific ad message they saw and what sort of bias was in that message, why would they deliver that message, to the invisible mechanisms like data collection or profiling that occur, I think those could be made more transparent.
Do any other panelists have any additional comments they want to share?
Yeah, I would kind of riff on that idea too. I feel like this is kind of an understudied area as to how we actually design effective transparency within there, because we can get into this regime where we're just bombarded with information within there. So I'd like to see more kind of interdisciplinary research to really figure out what is effective transparency mechanisms within there, because again, the platform sometimes, right, they have the super small font, they have, the color that blends in with the background and stuff like that within there. So trying to work out what are the things that make transparency effective and actually informing people, including kids and adults.
So I think that's a really good point, but there is a lot of research out there about that. And most of that research shows that there is no amount of design, there's no amount of changes that we can make to make consent at scale understandable, truly informed, voluntary, and effective, whether it's for kids or for adults. There's a ton of research out there, specifically about privacy, but also and about data collection, but also about things like understanding terms of service. The problem is the scale of it, right? So we all know about deceptive patterns, sometimes called dark patterns or deceptive patterns. We know how designers will A/B test boxes, and Damon, you mentioned small fonts. They'll A/B test a color here, a position there, a moving this box here and there, just to see what design of a box, what design of a page gets the most engagement. The incentive structure is there to use every trick in the book to make consent impossible or to make people give up when it comes to consent. And when it comes to transparency, there is simply no way, based on the research that exists, there's simply no way that transparency is the answer here. Right? More information just creates more infoglut, using a phrase from Julie Cohen's book, Between Truth and Power, which I recommend everyone read. So we have to move beyond the traditional trite recommendations of we need more information or we want systems that are hidden to be transparent. I don't care if those systems are transparent. Transparency is absolutely not going to work to give people the tools that they need to make the kinds of informed consent that the law and traditionally our norms would expect. So if that's the case, we have to move beyond consent. We have to create systems in place that, instead of putting the onus on individuals, because it's not just kids that are incapable of making these decisions, it's adults too. We are incapable generally, given how we're manipulated online, of effectively managing our own privacy or managing what we see online. And as a result, a legal regime focused entirely on transparency is exactly what companies want. And it's exactly why they lobby when people propose in state legislatures and the federal Congress, when people propose even minimal regulation when it comes to privacy or the surveillance economy. That's why they all say, yes, we're totally in favor of transparency, because they know that no amount of transparency is ever going to change their underlying business model, because even the maximum amount of transparency is still going to have people just click agree.
But I want to just respond to that by saying there's a legal argument and there's a developmental argument. So you can make and both can exist at the same time. And you can have digital environments that are teaching kids as you go. They don't have to be teaching with information. They could be teaching informally by including design that's designed for a dyad. So you're talking to your parent while you're using the technology that you're using, so that there are little micro interactions that occur on the interface that are giving kid hints of what's going on below the surface. This, I get it. This is part of the digital literacy, or kids building mental models of technology and how they work and how they can be used and how they influence them back. That may not be a solution from a legal standpoint, but it definitely is it's been a total blind spot to lots of UX design when we're thinking about kids and technologies and their well-being. So you have kids just kind of using these very frictionless, algorithmic spaces without a lot of the stoppage points or cues to let them know what's going on. So they kind of follow it as if it was, there was no other way that it could be designed. So I think there's a place for both of these sorts of solutions, so that it's not just, just a legal approach or just a design-based approach.
Yeah, and I would agree that transparency is just the beginning, and transparency ideally would kind of help us inform the other laws that are needed with there, because I agree that transparency on its own is not the solution. But it's hard for us to be informed enough to figure out what the other solutions are within there without at least starting with transparency.
Well, I want to ask a follow-up question on that, because I think it raises some really interesting points, especially for researchers who are used to having to go through an IRB and write consent forms, and the importance of informed consent, and seeing how it's treated so vastly different on these user agreements. And that consent. And I think you make a compelling case in terms of just the burden to the consumer, but also just the information overload. And even just within research, we know that the longer the consent form is, the less likely people are going to actually read it. And as users of many of these platforms, we're often not given choices. It's, if you want to use this, you agree. And so I guess my follow-up question is then what's the alternative? And I think and perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Ari, I got the impression that you were saying, suggesting that we move away from informed consent. And so I guess I wasn't quite clear on what that alternative would be then.
Sure. So it's my view that any kind of regulation, when we're talking about, and I take Jenny's point, right? I'm talking about, the regulatory tools here that allow for data collection. I'm not talking about anything else. We certainly need to teach kids what it means to consent and how to navigate that in real life. But I've written quite a bit about how we need to completely toss a paradigm for a legal paradigm or a paradigm for regulating the information economy that is based on the management of our own privacy. So I'll talk about what that means, and then I'll talk about an alternative very briefly. So what does that mean? If you look at all of the proposed privacy bills, almost all of the proposed comprehensive privacy bills that have been introduced at the state level in the United States and have passed, they're almost entirely rights-based regime. They give rights to, people have rights to access their information, people have rights to delete their information, right to correct, and some other things. So all of those things, and that's like the be all and end all of privacy regulation at the state level, almost. So privacy regulation is based on us having to take the initiative to A, understand how to do this stuff, and B, to take the initiative to think that this is actually relevant. And then all it is you click a button, you get your data, and so forth. There are other things you have to do, but this is entirely what Daniel Sullivan called privacy self-management. They're rights of control, the idea that you could sort of have some control about where your data goes. Transparency and consent are part of that. We also know that every time consent is an operative tool for companies to collect data on us, it overtakes any other means of collecting data. So whenever you hear a regulator or a law professor or a lawyer say, well, consent has to be part of a privacy framework, essentially what they mean is that consent will be the privacy framework. Because studies show that the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which is their comprehensive privacy law, they have 6 lawful bases for companies to collect data. Consent is one of them, and it accounts for 76% of all corporate data collection under the GDPR. 76%, and there are 5 other versions. So consent takes up all of these. So we need to absolutely eliminate or take away, never consider privacy self-management or consent as regulation at all. Instead, we need to think beyond, we also need to think beyond compliance, which is what data protection is, which I've written quite a book about how companies recast their compliance requirements like impact assessments and audits, and essentially manipulate them into just checkbox regulation. So instead, I think we need to think about privacy in more of like a third wave, a more structural type of reform. If we are interested in stopping exploitation of children's information, then we need to stop it, right? Our regulators and our experts and our scholars have to get much more comfortable with the word ban, And we've lost the ability over the last 50 years of neoliberal and managerial governance to realize that the power of the state is such that it could stop companies from doing something, which we just don't think about that anymore. We need to empower regulators to move outside of paperwork, which functions as a form of governance, and instead focus on things that that allow for more democratic participation or more public governance. And we have a whole issue of the journal Law and Contemporary Problems coming out with recommendations that include tossing cost-benefit analyses, that include eliminating managerial compliance, and focusing far more on limitations of the business model involved. So simply whether that involves eliminating types of data that companies can collect, eliminating targeted advertisements for certain groups, simply not and returning to traditional contextual advertising, or whether we're talking about empowering regulators to hold executives criminally liable for manipulation of data, whether that involves disgorgement of all ill-gotten gains from data that improperly collected from individuals and the algorithms that are generated from them. Instead of just saying, stop doing that, and then slap them on the wrists and have them submit an audit every 2 years after extracting data from people and creating really powerful and profit-making algorithms, why can't we have our regulators say, sorry, you have to give all that up because you misused data based on this statute that we passed? There are tons of other models. There are tons of other regulatory models that people can consider. You know, I'm not one, and I'll just end with this. I'm not a person who will always say, oh, please, won't we think of the children as a means of, you know, empowering government to do bad things, right? All you have to do is just look at what's happening in Florida to see the risks of just rhetorically relying on protecting children for government power. But children and adults are victims of the surveillance economy here. So these recommendations of putting the onus on, or restrictions on what corporations can do, as opposed to requiring us to do all the work, applies to everyone.
Thank you so much. I want to open it up to questions from the rest of the committee. Jeff, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Julianne. And I can't turn my video on for some reason. It says that the host has stopped video sharing. So I'll just ask my question. At first, I want to just start by saying thank you all. First, Damon, you know, we watched over at Stanford as you went through that. I'm so sorry it happened, and thank you for doing what you did and speaking out. So just want to say thanks, and sorry you had to go through that. Ari, I couldn't agree more with your last point there. I think that notice and consent is just terrible. We've, with Alessandro Christie, made an argument from an evolutionary point of view why that is going to fail. And I like your point that there's a whole bunch of other models that'll be really important. So thank you for sharing that. My question, though, is for Jenny. Thank you for doing this. I think it's really getting at this notion of content, which often gets ignored when we're thinking about media and well-being. Could you say a little bit more about your views of how the content of the ads differ relative to advertising that children are exposed to on, let's say, TV, magazines, etc.? I heard one point you said, which is obvious, is that, you know, there's like 30 seconds on TV. How do you see the content within social media, streaming sort of platforms as sort of importantly different for children compared to TV?
So you can still, let's use YouTube for an example. You can still get the kind of pre-roll ads that kids, I find, anecdotally recognize because they're annoying and they block their viewing, or they're the interstitial ads that pop up in the middle of a video. And so those are the same sort of, like, you know, 10 to 30 second spots that kids are more likely to recognize as an ad. Although the prior research suggested that ages 6 and under, kids still have a hard time recognizing that as an advertisement with persuasive intent compared to just other content. Like, you know, I remember my son yelling he wanted to see the vacuum TV show again, and when he was 3, and it was an ad for vacuums. So then there is more kind of embedded, it's been called, you know, stealth advertising, because it's not appearing in these predictable ways. That the theory is that you have these cognitive defenses that you can say, that's an ad. I'm not going to, I know they're trying to persuade me and I'm not going to follow what they say. And it's thought, you know, from the TV research that those abilities come online when you're a teenager. And that in between like 7 and 13, you need help from a caregiver to help you recognize someone else's persuasive intent. But it's harder when it is a character on TV, whether it's like Ryan's Toy Review, or whether it's an influencer you really like, or a media personality who is using a product. And so influencer marketing is one of those gray zones that it's harder because you have more emotional processes going on when you are either aligned with someone you like and who's an entertainment figure. And emotional processes in advertising are more implicit. They don't use the cognitive defense. It's more, it feels good. It's kind of, you know, a little bit more hedonic. Same thing with gamified advertisement. So if you get extra rewards and candies and gameplay items for watching an ad, you know, there's perhaps this linkage between that pleasure and the ad content. And then the last part that's just hard is that so much on platforms like YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, the culture itself is self-branding, right? So you get these new norms of promoting yourself or displaying yourself in certain ways through influencer culture, through selling your merchandise, through eliciting comments, like, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. So there's different sort of ways that it's more embedded into identity than it is a cognitive process. And that's where there's been recent, you know, Federal Trade Commission workshops and comment periods about this, trying to decide how to regulate or whether to ask for there to be clearer age-appropriate disclosures when this sort of more stealth marketing is occurring. And I think in our case, what we also found was some of the ads are just irrelevant to kids. I mean, so much of the YouTube ads, if we were watching Cocomelon or something else that was like clearly a little kid show, you could get political ads. You could get ads for like cars and universities and all this other stuff. So we kind of felt like there's this inefficiency in the ad ecosystem too, that just adding distractions for kids while not actually leading to persuasion of anyone. And that just felt like a sloppy place that, you know, we gave YouTube some feedback about, to kind of say, how do you kind of clean this up so that there's less ad load for kids, they can enjoy what they want to watch, and it's not just wasted ad dollars or, you know, impressions.
Thank you.
Miguel?
Hi, thanks. So maybe I would like to follow up, but you know, at the end of the day, we care if all this targeting and all this that we have talked about has consequences, right? And I think that it would be very, very valuable to actually know if you have any knowledge. So in previous meetings, we have discussed about, for instance, like unhealthy diets and how ads can make kids actually want unhealthy food and those kinds of things. But besides that, it's not clear, right? A causal effect between what is, you know, we could think logically between having these ads targeted and actually, you know, bad consequences for the kids. So beyond the unhealthy eating and that, are you aware of actual, you know, consequences of this kind of advertising behavior?
So I'll answer that first. I think that there's in our AAP policy statement, we focus on a couple different domains that we thought were problematic. So there's advertisements for illicit substances, drugs, alcohol, you know, things that we're seeing right now on social media sites distributing fentanyl and other sorts of illicit substances. And that's not necessarily advertising. That's someone promoting their products. But then there's also been evidence that Native American or African American populations are, especially youth, are targeted with other unhealthy, either tobacco, marijuana, alcohol, or other unhealthy content, especially if it's youth. And then there's also been some emerging research about the way beauty norms are displayed on advertising, that if there is more whiteness or more straight hair or more other beauty ideals about thinness or other things that are conveyed through advertisements, then that in itself is harmful to the developing identity of teenagers. And then finally, what we're finding too is that some of the ads themselves are just gross. I mean, we find ads with lots of violence. We're seeing ads with that are kind of alluding to sexual violence. They're alluding to all of this really heavily dramatic relationship drama. These are in-app ads that are really surprising. And I'm kind of like, who is driving this bus? Who is monitoring to make sure that the ad content itself isn't offensive? And so I think there are multiple different ways that ads can be harmful.
I think it's I think all of that is great. There's more to say, I think, on the point on beauty norms and or expectations, that there obviously, as Jenny was alluding, there are racial implications and socioeconomic implications to that, and that information that's well known and well documented in literature. The connection between those kind of norms set in advertisements as well as influencers that are advertising their products or sharing their products also goes to bullying and harassment and suicide, right? You started, Miguel, your question by saying we've already talked about the negative health effects, and then you said, but is there really evidence that there is actual harm? Well, the health effects are enormous, and to discard that and ask for more information and more data it skips over some of the most extraordinary harms, especially that children in minoritized groups face. Now, I got into the work that I do partly at a time when internet advertising and internet content was contributing to a rash of bullying and social norm related suicide and suicidal ideation among young girls and queer kids. So those health effects should not be skipped over as insufficient to warrant a response.
And I feel like sometimes we try and latch onto the content too much. And there's definitely, right, there's the algorithms, as other people have said, are the ultimate arbitrators in pushing of this information within there. And so we really need to figure out how to design safer algorithms. I feel like that won't propagate this type of harmful content as much.
Dr. Budak?
Thank you, and thank you for great insights. My question is, I guess, related to different, maybe other ways in which this kind of information can be used by different stakeholders. I think we've focused a lot on regulation, and I think you made great reasons as to why we should pay attention to that. But I'm wondering also, consumers also play sort of a big role here, and thinking through sort of systems that reveal such information to consumers to take action. So I'm more thinking things like the Sleeping Giants sort of movement that happened on Twitter, where consumers were basically pressuring advertisers to change their behaviors. So I'm curious if you see sort of any currently successful or could be successful ways in which we can change these systems through participation by the consumers, by the youth and adolescents and their parents and so forth. So any insights there would be appreciated.
I mean, I have seen, more youth-led movements getting involved, mostly in legislative advocacy, like pushing the California Age-Appropriate Design Code through, and parent collective advocacy has started a bit more through groups like Parents Together. But I think those have largely been focused on systems level change through legislation.
I think there are a couple of, it's a tough question because the inclination is to say, like, the source of positive change is going to be ground up movements, right? Like that it's a very common thing especially for law professors, to say about how to solve problems. But I'm really concerned about parent driven movements. Again, I mean, I hate to like rag on Florida, but I think it sort of deserves it these days. But I mean, look at parent driven movements about safety in Florida. Right now, those are supporting the state government's efforts to ban drag shows, to ban books that mention Black people in schools, that consider queer expression to be grooming or offensive to children. So I am concerned, and have often been concerned when I've sat on these trust and safety councils, when companies say, well, we have to listen to parents. Parents do not always have their children's best interests in mind. And we have to acknowledge and accept that sometimes we can't rely on a trans kid's parent to know and do what's in their best interests. So while it's also great to see the kinds of youth-led social movements for gun safety, for example, they're parent-led social movements I'm a little skeptical about, but also I don't have a lot of faith. I don't have a lot of faith that these are going to be, or even progressive ones are going to be, the tools to get us out of this mess. Partly because the norms and the rhetoric around how we think about data collection, right? Well, we consented to it, so my parent said it was okay, or a busy parent just clicked the button, right? We just understand, and we have internalized this idea that makes it all okay. And the fact that it's very hard for us to see the proximate harms of these behaviors, it's just very difficult. And I found this in my research, it's very difficult to galvanize the kind of social movement that I think we need, that would be necessary in order to make effective ground up change.
And I will, Ari, again, like you are talking on the legal level, and I totally understand the argument there, but those are politically motivated parent movements. I think parents on a community level are talking about this all the time. And when I talk to parents at Head Starts, when I talk to parents at PTO meetings, like they're all concerned about this and they don't know what to do. So I don't want to send the message that parents can't be trusted to kind of know how to mobilize around this, but I think it's going to be very local. And it's going to be a matter of, they did not grow up with the same sorts of technologies and the same sorts of environments. They feel totally lost, and they really want some more ideas of how to even just start a conversation with their kids about these things. And so this is going to happen on a family level, not a political level, in terms of the role of parents and feeling like I know how to connect with my kid and I know how to talk with them about these sticky, tricky issues.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And right, we operate groups to try and help some of these parents within here and trying to inform them about privacy and the techniques and the threats that they and their children are going to face in terms of this, to try and educate and kind of empower these parents, because these parents sometimes come to us in these kind of one-on-one settings asking, concerned about their children and wanting to understand what are the privacy threats and what can we do to mitigate them within there. So yeah, I agree that there's different levels, and this hyper local one-on-one communications can sometimes be effective.
Thank you. Jeff Hancock.
Yeah, thank you for all this conversation. It's great. This is a question that kind of came up in a debate between Jenny and Ari, but goes to Damon's point about like the algorithms being important. And that is this idea of mental models or folk theories that I think children in particular, but also parents have about these technologies. And I agree, like Ari's sort of coming at this like legal point, and Jenny, you're talking sort of like about the people having the experience, and Damon, you're thinking about the algorithm behind. And I'm just wondering, like, what would you as panelists say is our responsibility around educating people to be able to think about what these systems are, partly to help make decisions about what they want their child to see or not see? And so I know we have like sort of 3 levels of analysis here, which is always hard to connect, but I'm thinking of this like education piece of it. And I don't mean education necessarily like, you know, you're in school or whatever, but like how responsible are we as society for helping parents, helping kids understand what these things are so they can make their own choices?
I mean, I think that there's a real need for some changes to the user interfaces to begin with that give parents and kids a little bit more control and options, so they can test out how it feels when they turn the algorithm off. They can test out how it feels when they give feedback of what made them feel icky or made them feel awesome. And they can kind of see the way the algorithm changes. So I think some of it is experiential learning, is what I'm saying, is that we need to set up the conditions so we can help parents and kids have these conversations, and it's less of a parents controlling what kids can see in an algorithm, which is where you get into all those really difficult topics of a parent who isn't, you know, supportive of a trans or LGBTQ plus kid. And I think that I know we can't always assume that that parent is going to have the bandwidth and emotion regulation to sit there with a child and explore that space with them. But I really think that when I talk to kids and parents about their experiences in these sorts of social media spaces, they're watching. They're always watching. They're like, oh, Facebook enabled this new thing where I get a notification when someone else posted and it has nothing to do about me, and they find that annoying, and they're already commenting on the decisions that they know the tech company is making. And those are really important natural experiments that we could they don't have to be experiments. They could really be ways of shifting your usage or using platforms that don't have those design affordances and letting families experience that and learn through themselves rather than it being a didactic, here's how the tech algorithms work. Because I think that's interesting to some people who love to intellectualize it, but a lot of families learn through that sort of experiential learning and seeing it less as like a screen time failure, but more of this is how we're going to figure out how our family works with technology.
So I guess we want that, but the problem is, right, is that there's these dark patterns and these forces that the companies are going to try and do. And so the worry, as you know, the previous research has shown, is this illusion of control. And right, you turn the knobs and you do the settings, and right behind the scenes, they don't really do anything. They're not connected to anything within there. And so this is where we need regulators, FTC and stuff like that, to step in so that we get real control, we get real knobs that are actually connected and actually make these systems safer and do the things that people think they're supposed to be doing.
I totally agree. And I think you see my optimism both is because I'm like a pediatrician and I'm like, I have to tell families that there's a way through this. But I also think it's because I've worked so much with PBS Kids and Sesame Workshop and the people who are not doing this sort of deceptive pattern approach to their UI design. They're not collecting data. They're really just trying to make it as child-centered as possible. So we know there are examples of that being possible, and it's just not necessarily these large social media platforms because they weren't designing with the child as first principle.
I appreciate that, and I also appreciate Jenny's optimism. My sister's a pediatrician, and she feels the same way. But I didn't think Jenny and I were having a debate before to the framing of your question. But I think Jenny brings up a really important point: is that a lot of the source of some of any optimism that we might come from this is based on the fact that, to use a legal or political parlance, is that in the world of online child targeting, there's almost a public option right? There's PBS Kids. And so we can look to that as an example, as an experiment even, to what a public option in the world of the provision of an internet economy might look like. It hasn't really changed the kind of economic incentives that the more capitalistic oriented websites, how they're designed, right? Because they're still trying to make money. But at a minimum, we have an example of an alternative, right? And that alternative is not, it does not source on media literacy. It doesn't source on more information and more transparency. It doesn't source on rights of control. It sources on a government public option that is not profit oriented, and it's on there that you can engage in those kind of media literacy and how to deal with consent and how to deal with these issues and how to tailor your experience. But in a world where that doesn't exist, right, those options don't exist either because of the the overwhelming economic incentives to target anyone of any age for money. So maybe instead of coming out in favor, when we think about policy, and I recognize that this might be to some consider a radical proposal, but rather than thinking we need more media literacy, we need more transparency, we need to understand how the algorithm works. In fact, what we need is a public option for all of these things, because on that public option platform, right, can we then provide a robust, non-capitalistic, non-data extractive option for our kids and for adults as well.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
I think to wrap it up, unfortunately, I know this has been an incredibly rich conversation, but I'm just looking at time and noticing that we unfortunately do need to wrap up. But thank you so much for giving us so much to think about, and also some ideas of some optimism within these incredibly thorny issues. And I think I'll turn it back to who am I turning it to?
Yeah, you can go back to you. Thank you. Thank you. Let me echo thank you to Professors McCoy, Radesky, and Waldman. That was a really interesting conversation. And thank you to Professor Holt-Lundstad for moderating. We're going to move on to the last speaker for today. We're delighted to welcome Mitchell Baker, the Executive Chair and CEO of Mozilla Foundation and Mozilla Corporation, for some closing comments. I think I saw Mitchell Baker.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
There. Sorry, I saw your square and then I lost it. Hello, welcome.
Yes. Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and that was a really fascinating panel. I think in the closing remarks, what I'd like to do is pick up on some of the themes from the panel, in particular, transparency, consent, systematic change, the question of harm, and maybe try to add a little from the perspective of someone who's building and shipping internet-related products. Mozilla Foundation is, maybe you call it a semi-public option. We are a nonprofit, tax-exempt organization trying to create technology alternatives for a better form of online life. And so, for the law professors there, we have a subsidiary that pays taxes so that we can run a business with our products. So we're also trying to figure out, how do you run an ethical business as well? And because of our nonprofit status, we are explicitly not about pulling every penny out of the market, because we are a technology company trying to build and ship product and compete with the giants. We do need to sustain ourselves with revenue. And so I find that dynamic tension very helpful. In the past, Mozilla has been so absolutist about things that we've made our products untenable. For those of you who were Firefox users and shifted to Chrome about 10 years ago when it first came out, it was a better product. They were collecting data on how you use Chrome long before we would allow ourselves to do any of that. And so we have learned through a lot of pain over the years that there is some use of data today to actually build and ship a product in the market that you have to do. Now, I am not in any way saying that advertising practices or targeting ads are that. like not at all. But that the absolutist view about data is bad, like the right way to help people and the right way to protect privacy is just to not have it and not want it has caused some near-death experiences for us. And so we're living in that tension. We have been long-term advocates for transparency, for access for researchers, for a range of privacy things. We are a little bit, bite the hand that feeds us because our business funding comes through search. So it comes through really Google and Bing. So like that's an advertising business. Nevertheless, we have led the charge in anti-tracking protection through browsers, which we can't do anything about in ads or anything else. But certainly if you continue, if you're using your browsers, you have a lot more protection than anywhere else. And that's, Mozilla's been the leader in that. But it's not enough, clearly. And so absolutely, in terms of transparency is necessary and hand in hand with access for researchers. So we're very eager. We've been quite engaged in policymaking in Europe as well. And so very eager to see these landmark European legislation come into effect. There is still a lot of work to do and what it means to actually implement them in the details. In part because obviously the technology players are very active in what implementation looks like. And we need a voice of multiple organizations that are building and shipping products, but can explain, or have different motives. And Mozilla tries to be that voice, given our, nonprofit core. And hopefully over time, we'll see more of those. 100% agree that transparency and individual consent is not a solution. It's a solution to get research and to be able to use that research both to build better products, which is what part of Mozilla iLead is for, and also to design better regulation. And so I see a cycle in the question between individual action, which transparency and consent are aimed at, and systematic change is a level of learning and product differentiation, and I hope competition in products, which we have very little of today. And it is actually my greatest complaint about Mozilla of the last 5 or 10 years is not producing enough alternatives. I do hope to change that going forward. But in that sort of theory of change or cycle of change is learning and understanding, transparency, researcher access, building different products. So that's a different model or a different, we're still organized within the system, but the nonprofit parent, what our shareholder wants is not financial return. That's a hard way to compete in the technology world. There aren't many. Now there's Signal, which was set up a few years ago. But there aren't many. So it's hard. It's important, I think, that we continue to try to do that because I do believe part of the solution is in product. And product alternatives that are better might even provide better user experience. They might be less profitable. And that's why we're set up so that profit isn't at the core. But I do feel pretty strongly that we need some product experimentation in that cycle of change. Because sometimes the mass consumer, it's hard to imagine what could be until you see it. When we were building Firefox, this is a long time ago, there was a browser, it was the Microsoft. And these days, Chrome has the majority, but in those days, it was Microsoft. And over and over and over again, I was asked, who needs a browser? Microsoft's put it in the operating system, it's irrelevant. Well, it wasn't until you could show how life could be different, then, people can respond really differently. Because parents in particular are trying to figure out, what do I do? And some adults are, but it's a massive load. Like I also 100% agree that an individual cannot protect themselves. And that yes, it's important to have transparency and consent and all of these mechanisms, but that is not enough. Most people don't have time and attention. If there's no other product, you're out of luck. And I can't protect myself if you don't protect me either. You know, I live in a world where if you're using a range of products that are watching and tracking and targeting you, and I'm engaging with you, I'm caught up with it. It doesn't matter, you know. I try to turn off Meta or Instagram or Facebook. Like my interactions with other people pull me into these things. And so there's really no way to protect yourself. And I think many of the things that we think about with children, you know, they haven't quite learned, or their brain hasn't quite developed to some of the things adults can do. But even as adults, we have emotional responses and we're not totally rational all the time. And so even though we might learn what advertising is, we're not immune to, you know, the forces that can act upon us. And those forces are increasingly powerful. You know, with the amount of data, you know, it's possible to predict what you are going to do next much better than probably you can predict. And so the ability to understand oneself, you know, and one's sense of self, we value. And yet with enough data, you know, I can probably get you to do a lot of things. And I can probably predict what it takes to get you to buy something or to spend more or to, you know, buy the product I want or to believe the idea I want you to want, not the one that is more objectively accurate. And that's a lot of power to be aimed at us. And even adults with all the training and learning and education, we're not so totally robotic in our understanding of things to be able to respond to these massive forces that are aimed at us. And so I also see that this research into children and then building into the research on adults, and we are going to have to build an expectation of the safety of the technology that we use that is systemic in nature, and at least as a minimum. And allow each of us to, you know, fine tune it if we want and use that consent for the fine tuning around the edge, but not for the basic question, are you totally exposed to the tracking and manipulation that's possible? Right, that's going to get worse. I mean, you know, we can see with images and text in the last 3 or 4 months, that's what's truth, what should you believe, what do you understand? Like these problems are getting harder right now. And so the sense of needing systematic change, the understanding and research and transparency, fundamental to building something better, does need to be coupled with new products and with motivation, either because you have it in you or because regulation demands it, for business models that are better for individual people and better for society, you know, even if they're not quite as profitable. I mean, safety regulations for other industries might cause them to be less profitable, but we still have them. You know, we still require a lot before you ship a car. So the technology challenges, I think, will continue. We do see some changes, or there are places in the system where people are experimenting with technology that's different. You know, how much less profitable is it to run an ad system if you're not doing this targeted tracking? You know, ads do maintain a lot of the web, you know, whether or not I personally enjoy the experience. Newspapers, TV, you know, ads are part of the system. And so at Mozilla, we haven't been fighting the ads, we've been fighting the tracking, as I said before. But if it's less profitable, how much less profitable? What does that look like? We can run a business that's less profitable than, you know, a giant. So you have to have like the technology development of how much data do you need? How quickly can you get rid of it? Can you not attach it to a single person? Like there's a fair amount of, well, I'd say a fair amount of effort underway. None of these are at scale right now. Certainly the things that are at scale are the organizations that have the data to start with. And so many smaller technology organizations have similar problems to researchers, in that the data corpus is held in the hands of a few. And so you're either trying to recreate it or understand what people want in different ways. But there is a fair amount of work going on. There have been advances recently in cryptography. One of the outputs of the blockchain era were increases in cryptography. And so, you know, some hope that we can build systems that do provide customized experiences, but without the kind of data leakage. And that I think is also an important step, like the technical ability to then build a society and whatever regulatory framework we want, which addresses not just the leakage of data, but the manipulation of children and adults as well. And so I think there's hope, but it's a lot, it's a long way to go. It is really pretty tough to compete with the giants. So this competitive space where you might have a choice or try different products is tough to build. The advantage of having data makes it harder to compete. So it's not, I think it's not easy on any front. There are a set of technologists pretty good size who would like to be doing something better or different. We see that, because we try to hire them, and we don't have any equities, so we don't, have the giant upside, of the giants. But there are a lot of technologists who want to build something that's better, are willing to take some kind of discount, to top pay. Now, it's a highly paid industry, so you take that for what it's worth. But we do see, a lot of those people, and they come to Mozilla for that reason. So I think it's our hope that we can do a little better at getting some of those technologies out and some product alternatives, but also sparking that cycle of research, understanding, product experiment, legislation, research, because this effort to build technology that's as powerful as we have today, but is decent for societies and decent for individuals, like that's an ongoing piece. That's going to be true, well, probably forever, but we have such big changes in the technological landscape right now that it's certainly true for our lifetimes. And so trying to build that cycle. And I hope a few other organizations, maybe the B Corp structure encourages or allows that, but that are trying to, build technology and even succeed as businesses, but not at all costs. And that's a structure where maybe the public option, as suggested earlier, where things are PBS or BBC like, but the market is really powerful, and so maybe there's some way of a shift in the market. And again, I think B Corps are a step in that direction. It's a change in corporate structure that, we haven't seen so much of. We've had this massive deregulation of corporate structure over the last century. And B Corps are at least a step in adding some kind of governance to it for a larger public good. So all of these things, I think we need to experiment and try. And so research across all of them is fundamentally important. I'm really thrilled to be able to join you here. Certainly the panel and the work you're doing is both fascinating today, but fundamental. And we look towards the work that you've been doing pretty regularly. So also appreciation, from our little part of the world of what you're trying to bring into understanding and actually building a better world. And maybe I'll just stop here and see where questions or conversation takes us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for really interesting comments. Maybe I'll start with a question, if you don't mind, and we'll open it up to all the panelists with any questions. I thought you correctly identified there are two paths. One is sort of a path where the makers of these tools, just use those terms generally, decide to lean into doing them in a pro-social way, even if that meant forsaking of some profit, or also if there's some regulation to require heading down that path. I thought you were perhaps more balanced in the likelihood of those two options than I might be. It seems to me like there are other things you said that would suggest that the former approach is perhaps less likely, just because there are many complicated forces that push anyone who is in a for-profit entity to maximize profit. And that is through no one's malintent. It's just simply how the system is set up. So let me ask you then to perhaps to comment on the latter approach. What do you think would be perhaps the likeliest, most accessible way of introducing regulatory guardrails to optimize the pro-social interface between social media and the rest of the world, and what would it take to actually get there? I think we can all fantasize about there's a whole set of things that can be done. That's fine. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, what is most accessible, most feasible, most likely to work in a relatively shortish period of time?
Well, now we'll come full cycle, because I do think the transparency and understanding piece of what's actually happening. And also we'll see something come out of Europe, but what are the targeting criteria for ads, and who are you targeting them at, and what are you getting and why, and who's actually buying them? And as the panel, discussed, that's can't be the ending point, because now everything is on the individual to address. But I do think that understanding what's happening is going to be a key piece. In the United States today, that's not even easy, right? With the current proposals of what's going on. I'm personally very interested in the European prohibition on political ads, which exists, but which was not, I'm thinking back to 2018 or but the implementation of that in the online system is still early, and when we were trying to engage with the Facebook APIs in particular, not workable. And so that's an area in which I really do wonder, because Europe already has these laws that prohibit a certain kind of political advertising in a certain time space, but it's not actually implemented there. And so I think the will to implement a law that's already been there on the books for a certain kind of content, that might be a short-term kind of semi-obvious next step. Not as true in the United States, but I think the learnings from all of those things will be global. And I think it's not exactly, I think regulation about portability of my own content and data. So if I wanted to move away from, one product and move somewhere else, what would I do with it? It's a little less useful now that, Facebook's bought other things, but I think that question that when the occasions when there are alternatives, you can just sort of pick up and move. That would be really helpful. Yeah, it's easy to forget that owning your own phone, having access to your own phone number, despite what cell phone you used, took legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And a very kind of obvious and maybe a small thing, but if you imagine your social graph, being something similar to that, then you actually can move and you have sort of more choices. So maybe I'll stop with that.
Okay, I did make note of how you changed the word owning to having access to. That seems to be emblematic of a lot of things that you said in your talk. So thank you for that distinction. Let me open it to everybody else. Please raise your hand and for comments or questions. There were a couple of questions from the audience. So let me just go there, which in the absence of committee comments. So there was one about transparency of the purpose of the algorithms is obviously lacking from the majority of all platforms. How do we even stand a chance to address it or educate others about when we can't understand this purpose? Everybody understands parental controls, but that's where the knowledge base typically stops. I think it's an excellent question. I was wondering if you can comment on that, Mitchell.
Yes. So maybe this is from the practical side of trying to live in the market, but my experience is what you're trying to do is get enough of advocates or consumer advocates, or it's a smaller percentage of people to understand and pay attention and control, and not like the full population, because it's busy and complicated and, just trying to, pay them more, whatever, it is a much higher priority. And so I think it's trying to build a system where the set of really interested people, i.e., researchers can understand. And you need different defaults in your products. And so I guess to answer the question specifically, I do think that it is possible to set up a regulatory system in which, researchers can get data and understand it. But I don't think it's possible to set up or I think it's much harder to set up a system where the average citizen, in whatever amount of time they have, is going to understand everything and be able to make the right choice. So I think you're looking for experts and researchers first, and then there are influencers in technology, and that word now has a marketing piece, but most people have, technologists or someone who is their expert who they're looking to, and those people can make radical changes. So what's the right choice? What's the right set of defaults? I do think in systems that have very complicated defaults, if we understood them, there are a set of people, probably a bunch in this room, who would understand them, and those are much easier to share and transmit than they were before. And so I do think that we will have a setting where there's a small set of experts who really pay attention. But the question is, can you just pick up their expertise and move it? That's a product that's a technical solution that allows you to do that. You can't do that today. If you read all the articles about how to protect your privacy and go here and change the setting and do that and do these 52 million things, if you can figure them out, but there's no technical way for that person to take their prescribed, suggested defaults and pick it up and apply it. And that's where technical solutions can play a role. And that's, why we're still in the market, trying to do those things.
Let me ask, there's one more question. I'll paraphrase a little bit about stealth advertising. Was stealth advertising entering the mainstream, including, for example, getting people sign up for things they don't mean to sign up? And build on the last thing you said. Do you think that of something like that, the solutions are ultimately technical, or are they human from the point of view of things like consumer protection type efforts?
Well, I might quibble because I think some consumer protection is technical. Take a modern car today, right? Stealth advertising. Yeah. Well, I'm going to imagine if you're a content creator and you are essentially a propagandist, that you can create content. Now, are you a propagandist for ads, or are you a propagandist, for political ideas? That's probably human. I'm trying to imagine various TV shows from the past that express a political point of view. Were they made to express that point of view and were popular, or did someone do research on what point of view is going to make the most money? I don't know, but I think, there's some things you can do, when ads are streamed in from a different place than the rest of the content, at least in a browser, which I know, but you can tell those things and you can give warnings that it comes from different content, but increasingly experiences do come from different places. So yeah, if someone's writing a kids show and the characters are saying certain things, if that's what you mean by stealth advertising, I think.
Yeah. No, I think
that's probably a human piece.
Your reference to the combination of human and technological makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Let me see if there's any other comments from the committee before we wind down. Okay, if hearing none, first of all, Mitchell, if I may, thank you. Thank you. It was really, really interesting comments, and thank you for what you're doing. It was a really excellent counterpoint to some other things that we've heard, and thank you for moving the work forward.
Thank you. My pleasure, and likewise.
And to everybody, both our panel as well as people who are listening in, we will adjourn for the evening, and we are going to reconvene tomorrow in open session again, same time, 1 o'clock Eastern. Everybody, thank you for being with us today. Have a good afternoon and evening. Take good care.